Tonight, keep your lights on and your volume up. In this video, 11 most disturbing true Seattle horror stories, you are not just listening. You are stepping into the rain-soaked shoes of the people who lived these moments. Every voice you hear could be a neighbor, a co-worker, the person sitting next to you on the bus. As the stories unfold, pay attention to the small details, the tiny coincidences, the things that feel a little too familiar. By the end, you might start noticing them in your own life too. Welcome back to Haunted Fears. And if you dare to stay until the last story, consider joining the Haunted Fears horror family, so you are never alone in the dark again. Have you ever felt like a total stranger knew the layout of your home better than you do? That is the exact feeling that still crawls up my spine every time I hear footsteps in a wet, echoing underpass, or catch a glimpse of someone standing too still in the shadows. My name is Nixon, and this happened when I was working late nights down by the waterfront in Seattle, back when the old Alaskan Way viaduct still loomed over the street like a concrete ceiling. Most nights, I cut through Pioneer Square on my way home, weaving past the bars, the brick buildings, and the homeless camps tucked into doorways. It was faster than taking the main roads, and after a few months, the route felt routine. I knew which corners smelled like stale beer, which alley to avoid after midnight, and which blocks were usually empty except for the sound of the bay and the occasional distant ferry horn. That night, the rain had been steady since afternoon, the kind that doesn't pour but soaks everything slowly, seeping into your shoes and cuffs. The brick sidewalks gleamed under the orange sodium lights, and the viaduct above me caught the sound of passing cars and bounced it back down, so it felt like the city was humming right over my head. I'd stayed later than usual, finishing some paperwork, so it was closer to 1 a.m. than my usual midnight walk. The streets were almost empty, just a couple of figures huddled under awnings and the distant wail of a siren somewhere uptown. I cut under the viaduct like I always did, following the route that dropped me closer to the bus stop I used, even though I was planning to walk all the way home that night. The air under there always felt heavier, like the concrete pressed the sound and the smell down onto you. Salt from the bay mixed with exhaust, and everything echoed. My footsteps, the drip of water from the joints above, the occasional car rumbling along the upper deck. Halfway through the underpass, I noticed him. At first, it didn't register as anything unusual. Just another dark shape in the shadows, someone taking shelter from the rain, standing near one of the thick support columns. But as I got closer, the shape sharpened into a man. He was standing perfectly still, facing the wall, his back to the street. No umbrella, no hood up, just a dark coat hanging off him like he'd been standing there a long time. What really got to me, though, was that his head was tilted slightly toward the wall and his jaw was moving. He was muttering. I slowed down, my footsteps slapping more quietly against the wet pavement. The echo made it hard to tell exactly where the sound was coming from, but as I passed within maybe 20 feet of him, I started to pick out words. At first it sounded like nonsense, just a soft, repetitive stream of syllables. Then a phrase cut through that made my body go cold. He said my street name. Not a big famous street, not a main road. A small side street in a quiet neighborhood a good distance away from downtown. I told myself I misheard. Maybe some other word that sounded similar. The underpass threw sound around in weird ways. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept walking, looking straight ahead, telling myself not to make eye contact, not to do anything that might start a conversation. The closer I got, the clearer it became. He wasn't speaking randomly. He was reciting an address, my address. The numbers came next. House number, street, even the apartment number tacked onto the end. He spoke it slowly, like he was trying to memorize it, his forehead almost close enough to touch the rough concrete of the support column. I could see now that his hands were at his sides, fingers slightly curled, not shivering, not moving, just his mouth working, over and over. My first instinct was denial. There are other cities, other states, where that same combination of numbers and street names probably existed. It could be coincidence. It had to be. I told myself that as I forced my pace to stay normal, not speed up too much, even though my heart had started beating in that way where you feel it in your throat. As I drew level with him, I held my breath. The sound of his voice stuck to the concrete, a whisper bouncing back at me from all directions. My name was not on his tongue, but my life was. The route I took home, the bus line I sometimes caught, the small details of where I lived flashed in my mind like a map I suddenly didn't trust anymore. He didn't turn. He didn't stop. He just kept muttering the address. But there was a change I almost missed. His voice dropped lower, and instead of repeating the street, he started describing something else. A color. A smell. He mentioned the color of my front door. That was enough. I walked faster, my footsteps louder, splashing in the shallow puddles that had formed where the pavement sank. I didn't run, but every muscle wanted to. I could feel the weight of the viaduct pressing down, the orange streetlights flickering as if they were struggling to stay on long enough for me to pass. The distant sound of a ferry horn cut across the bay, long and lonely, and for some reason, that sound made it all worse. It felt like the city was watching. About a block past the man, the tension in my shoulders finally broke enough for me to exhale. I told myself again that it was nothing. People talk to themselves. People mumble. Maybe he was reciting his own address, and I was just projecting my own fears onto it. I didn't look back. I've always told myself not to look back when something feels wrong behind me. Just keep moving. 2 blocks later, I had convinced myself that by the time I reached home, I would laugh about it. Maybe tell someone at work the next day as a weird, late-night story. I was approaching the point where the viaduct ended, and the street opened up a bit, the air less trapped, the light less sickly orange and more mixed with white from newer lamps. I could see the intersection ahead, the wet crosswalk lines glowing faintly. A car idled at a red light, its taillights reflecting off the pavement. Then he was there, not behind me where I'd left him, in front of me, same coat, same height, same stillness. He stood a little off to the side, near the base of a light pole, this time facing the street, facing me. There was no sound of footsteps approaching, no shadow stretching out before him, as if he had just stepped out from between parked cars. 1 second, the sidewalk ahead was empty. The next second, he existed. That is how it felt. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the wet sheen on his hair, the way water gathered at the edge of his collar. His face was wrong in that way you can't always describe. Not deformed, not monstrous, just somehow off-center from everything around him. Too still, too pale in the sodium light. His eyes weren't wide, but they were open, fixed on me as if he'd been waiting there the whole time, expecting me. His mouth was moving again. This time, he wasn't saying the address. He was describing my apartment. Not in general terms, not the kind of details you can guess by looking at a building from the outside. He spoke about the rug just inside my door, the cheap one I'd picked up from a discount bin, dark blue with a fraying corner. He mentioned the coat rack that leaned slightly against the wall because one of the screws was stripped. He talked about the shoes lined up there, how one pair always sat crooked because the sole was coming loose. I stopped walking. I didn't remember deciding to. My body just froze as if my brain had hit a wall. The rain pattered steadily on the street, on the cars, on the concrete above and around us. I could feel cold drops sneaking past my collar, tracing down the back of my neck, but I couldn't bring myself to wipe them away. He kept going. He described the layout of my living room, the couch pushed against the left wall, the small coffee table with a ring from a mug I spilled months ago, the crooked picture hanging slightly too high because I didn't want to patch old nail holes. He spoke about the lamp in the corner with the dim bulb, the one I kept meaning to replace but never did. He even mentioned the plant on the windowsill that was always on the verge of dying, its leaves browning at the tips. I'd never posted pictures of my apartment online. I've always been paranoid about that. No videos, no walkthroughs, nothing that would show a stranger where I lived or how it looked. The windows in my building didn't give much away either. From the street, you might see the faint outline of a couch, maybe a light if the blinds weren't completely closed, but not the specific details of where things were or how messy they were. He spoke about the small crack in the ceiling over my bed. I hadn't told anyone about that. I noticed it one morning, a thin line that spidered out from the corner above my pillow. It bothered me, and sometimes I found myself staring at it at night, wondering if the building was slowly pulling itself apart. I never mentioned it to coworkers, friends, anyone. It was too mundane, the kind of thing you just live with. He knew. My mind scrambled for explanations. He could have been someone from the building, maybe a maintenance guy, someone who'd been inside before I moved in. But then he mentioned the mug I always left on the nightstand. The specific design on it, a logo from a band I liked in high school that almost no one remembers now. He described the way I stacked my books on the floor because I never bought a proper shelf. He was mapping my life out loud on a wet sidewalk at 1 a.m. And the worst part was that his voice never rose above that soft, steady murmur. He wasn't trying to scare me. It was like he was reading from a list, something he'd memorized, and was double-checking for accuracy. I took a step back. It was small, just enough to feel the heel of my shoe hit a shallow puddle. The cold water seeped in instantly, but I barely registered it. The man's eyes tracked the movement, but his body didn't shift. He didn't lean closer, didn't reach out. He just kept talking. Now he was describing my bathroom. The cracked tile near the tub, the mirror that didn't quite sit flush against the wall, the small rust spot on the faucet. He spoke about how I sometimes left the light on at night because the fan made a soft hum that helped me fall asleep when the city noise got too weird. I wanted to say something, tell him to stop, ask him who he was, how he knew these things, but my throat felt tight. Like the air under the viaduct had thickened into something heavier than oxygen. My breath sounded too loud in my own ears. Somewhere above us, a car roared past, its engine sound bouncing around the concrete, making it feel like the whole structure was growling. He smiled then. Not a wide grin, not a theatrical reveal, just a small knowing tilt of his lips, like he'd finally reached the part of the list that interested him most. He started describing my bedroom door. Not the door itself, but what I did with it. How I usually left it slightly open, never fully closed, because I didn't like the way the latch clicked. How the hallway light slipped through that narrow gap and drew a pale line across the carpet. How, on certain nights, I would wake up just enough to see that line of light and feel reassured that nothing had changed. Then he said, almost conversationally, that sometimes the line of light disappeared, even though I never heard the door move. That snapped something loose in me. I turned and walked away. Not ran. At least that's what I tell myself looking back. But my stride lengthened, my steps faster, the echo of my own footsteps chasing me as much as anything else. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I didn't want to know what he looked like moving, if he moved like other people, or if he glided across the wet pavement without sound. The rest of the walk home is a blur in my memory. I remember crossing intersections without fully registering the lights, trusting that the empty streets would stay empty. I remember my key slipping in my damp fingers as I tried to unlock the front door of my building. The hallway inside smelled like old carpet cleaner and dust, as always, but somehow that familiar scent made me feel a little less like I was falling. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly as he'd described. The rug, the coat rack, the shoes, the couch, the plant, the crack in the ceiling above my bed. Each detail felt like a fingerprint he'd left behind on my life, proof that he had been there, in some form, at some point, without my knowledge. I told myself it could all still be coincidence layered on coincidence. That was the only way I could get myself to sleep at all that night. I checked the locks 3 times. I pushed a chair under the doorknob, even though I knew it wouldn't really stop anyone determined. I closed my bedroom door completely for the first time in months, ignoring the way the latch clicked like a small gunshot. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up in the dark to the faintest sound, the creak of wood under weight somewhere in the apartment. Old buildings make noises, I reminded myself. Pipes shift, floors settle. But this sound had a rhythm to it, a slow, careful pattern, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart pounded so hard it almost drowned the sound out. I stared at the closed bedroom door, waiting for the handle to turn, for the line of light to appear underneath if someone turned on the hall light. Nothing happened. The sound stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and oppressive. In the morning, the chair under the front door was slightly askew. I moved within the week. I told the landlord I'd found a place closer to work, made up a reason about wanting more natural light, anything that sounded normal. I packed my things quickly, barely sleeping those last few nights, jumping at every creak and sigh of the building. The whole time, I imagined him standing somewhere nearby, maybe under another underpass, maybe in some dark corner of a parking garage, whispering the layout of someone else's home. Years have passed since then. I don't live in Seattle anymore. I try not to think about the viaduct, which is gone now, replaced by something newer and supposedly safer. But even far away, in a different city with different streets, there are moments when I'm walking alone at night, and the air feels heavy, the lights too dim, the echoes too close. Sometimes, in the reflection of a window, or a puddle, or a dark screen, I catch a silhouette behind me that looks just a little too still. When that happens, I don't turn around. I just keep walking, telling myself over and over that the man under the viaduct only knew that one apartment, that one life. Then I remember the way he smiled when he talked about my bedroom door, and I wonder how many other layouts he has memorized by now. Would you trust your instincts if you knew a face from an old photograph could predict who dies on your floor? I did not at first, and that is why some of the sounds in this building will never be just sounds to me again. My name is Laurel, and for 3 years, I worked the night shift as a nursing assistant at Harborview. People love to romanticize hospitals at night, like everything goes quiet and peaceful once visiting hours are over, but that is not how it feels from the inside. The fluorescent lights are too bright. The air always smells faintly of disinfectant and something metallic underneath, and the beeping of monitors never really stops. Nights stretch and warp in here. Sometimes 2 minutes feel like an hour, and sometimes you look up and 4 hours are gone. I worked mostly on the side of the hospital that connects to the ER, close enough that the overhead pages and trauma codes bled into our hallways. Even with the doors closed, you could hear the rhythm of it. Elevator dings, gurney wheels rattling over thresholds, clipped voices trying to stay calm while saying things that never are. There is a point in the night, usually between 3 and 4 in the morning, when everything gets too still and you start to notice every sound your brain usually filters out. That was when I first saw him. It was one of those heavy rain nights. The tall windows at the end of the hallway were streaked with water, and the city lights beyond them looked smeared, like someone had dragged a finger through wet paint. I was doing what I always did on slow stretches, checking charts, organizing supplies, pretending not to watch the vital signs from the rooms we were most worried about. The overhead lights hummed. A monitor alarmed briefly down the hall, then quieted after a nurse adjusted something. I went to drop some forms off at the small desk near the ER side, the one that faced a long corridor leading to the trauma rooms. When I turned the corner, I saw an elderly man sitting at the very end of the hallway, just before the double doors. He sat perfectly still in one of the plastic waiting chairs against the wall, hands folded loosely in his lap. His shoulders were slightly hunched, but not in a weak way, more like someone who had learned to endure discomfort without reacting. Even from that distance, I could see his hair was thin and combed back. He wore a long, dark coat that didn't match any of the hospital gowns or standard patient clothes, and he was facing the trauma room doors, not the windows. What startled me was that I had not heard those doors open. There is a distinct sound when someone comes onto our floor from the ER side. The whoosh of the doors, the brief collision of sounds from both environments, the echo of footsteps. I had heard nothing. 1 minute, the end of the hall was empty. The next, there he was, as if he had been part of the building all along, and my brain had only just noticed. I stood there with my stack of forms in my hand for a few seconds, trying to place him. Sometimes, family members slipped into weird corners to cry or get a moment alone, but even then they looked like they belonged to someone. This man sat like he was the one waiting for us. Not the other way around. "Can I help you?" I asked, automatically lowering my voice, even though there was no one sleeping in that part of the hall. He didn't respond. He did not even turn his head. His gaze stayed fixed on the trauma room doors, as if he were watching something I could not see through them. I walked closer. The disinfectant smell was stronger on that side, mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the ER break room beyond. The lights overhead were slightly harsher there, giving the hallway that pale, washed-out look. The man's skin looked almost like old paper in that light, not quite translucent, but thin, showing every shadow of bone beneath. "Sir?" I tried again. "Do you need help finding someone?" Nothing. No flicker of recognition, no irritation, no confusion, just that same quiet, intense focus. For a moment, I wondered if he was one of ours. Maybe someone who had come up from another floor, confused and wandering. But he didn't have a wristband on, not that I could see, and the coat was all wrong. Among hospital people, you develop an instinct for what looks like it belongs, and what doesn't. He didn't fit any category I had. I reached for the nearest door badge reader, intending to poke my head through into the ER and ask if anyone knew about a lost family member or confused patient. Before my hand reached the badge, a voice called my name from behind. I turned. One of the nurses was waving me down for help repositioning a patient. I glanced back at the man at the end of the hall. He was gone. No sound of footsteps, no creak of chair legs. The plastic seat where he had been sitting still rocked slightly. Just a tiny movement, like something had lifted off it. The doors at the end of the hall remained closed. The only sound was the distant ding of an elevator and the low murmur of voices from the nurses' station. I told myself I had imagined it. Night shifts do strange things to your perception. The brain fills in shapes at the edge of your vision. I pushed it aside and went back to work. Less than 10 minutes later, one of the monitors in a nearby room erupted in a violent alarm. A critical patient, one everyone had been cautiously optimistic about, started to crash. The next half hour became a blur of compressions, medications, shouted numbers, and that strange slowed-down feeling that sometimes comes with real emergencies. We got the patient back, but barely. Afterward, when the room was quiet again, except for the steady beeping of stabilizing vitals, I remembered the man at the end of the hall. The memory rode on the back of the adrenaline fading from my system. I did not connect the two events yet. People crash in hospitals. That is what they do here. We fix as many as we can. The second time it happened, I had no excuses. It was another night, a couple of weeks later. Different assignment, different patients, same dead zone of the early morning. The rain was lighter this time, just a fine mist that turned the windows into frosted glass. I was walking down toward the ER side to restock a cart when the hairs on my arms lifted for no good reason. It felt like walking into a room where someone had just been talking about you. I looked up, and there he was again, at the exact same spot. Same chair, same posture, same long coat, same fixed stare toward the trauma room doors. I stopped in the middle of the hallway. My shoes made a soft squeak against the polished floor, and the sound felt too loud. "Sir," I tried again, heart beating faster. "Are you waiting for someone in particular? Can I get you a blanket or something?" My voice sounded overly professional to my own ears, like I was reading off a script. The automatic part of me, the part trained to offer comfort and assistance, kept moving even while another part wanted to back away slowly. He did not blink. His eyes did not shift. From where I stood, I still could not quite see the exact color of his eyes, only that they were deeply set, shadowed. The overhead light picked a silver sheen off the thin strands of his hair. I took a few steps closer. The air felt colder near him. Not dramatically, not like walking into a freezer, but a subtle, piercing coolness that made me aware of every inch of exposed skin on my hands and neck. I glanced at the thermostat on the wall. It read the same as everywhere else. Before I could get close enough to see him clearly, a sound cut through the hall, the triple chime that precedes an overhead page, followed by a calm voice calling a code in one of the trauma rooms. The double doors at the end of the corridor burst open inward. For a heartbeat, my view of the chair was blocked by the movement of the doors. When they swung shut again, he was not there. The chair rocked slightly. I stared at it. In the far distance, I could hear people running, carts being pushed fast, the controlled chaos of a code in progress. I stood in that stark, humming hallway with a box of saline in my hands and realized my breathing had gone shallow. Later that night, after what started down in the ER rolled up toward us, in the form of a critically unstable transfer, I found myself thinking about him again. The timing had been too close. The code call, the doors opening, his disappearance. A pattern began to whisper at the edges of my mind. He appears. Someone near that area goes into crisis. I told myself it was superstition. Hospitals breed that too. You work around life and death long enough, and you start drawing lines between random dots just to feel some kind of order. The older nurses had their own stories. Rooms they did not like. Elevators that stopped on certain floors for no reason. Old legends about patients who never really left. I used to nod and smile at those stories, treating them like just another kind of break room folklore. Now I was starting to understand why people clung to them. The third time solidified the pattern. It was a quieter night than usual, the kind of shift where you almost start to relax, and that in itself makes you uneasy, like the building is catching its breath before something big. I went down the hallway toward the ER side, mainly to move, to shake off the sleepy stiffness settling into my shoulders. He was already there when I turned the corner. This time he was not staring at the trauma room doors. He was turned slightly toward the side, looking into one of the smaller rooms that branched off the hallway. A room that was dark, empty, its bed stripped, and waiting for whoever might need it next. His profile looked sharper from this angle, the line of his nose and jaw old-fashioned, in a way I could not immediately define. I froze before he could be the one to disappear. My instinct was to back away slowly, but something else, some mix of professional obligation and morbid curiosity, held me in place. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. My voice did not echo. It just dissolved into the hum of the lights and the distant beeping of machines. He did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on the empty room for several seconds. Then, without turning his head, he shifted his eyes to me. They were dark. Not in the sense of color. I honestly could not tell what color they were. They were dark in the sense that nothing in them seemed to catch the light. The reflective shine you expect in living eyes was somehow muted. I had the sudden, irrational thought that he had spent too long in dim rooms, that the brightness of the hallway did not belong to him. The silence stretched. I realized I was gripping the edge of the cart hard enough that my knuckles hurt. "Are you visiting someone?" I tried again, the words sounding small. His lips parted slightly. For a second I thought he might answer. Instead, the overhead speaker chimed again. Another code. Another room number called out that I knew was only a few doors away from where we stood. My stomach dropped. The double doors at the end of the hall flew open with familiar urgency. As staff rushed past me, the bright reflection off their badges and equipment created a stutter of light across the walls. When the movement cleared and the doors settled back, the chair was empty. The hallway beyond was bare. The air felt warmer all at once, as if a pressure had lifted. The patient whose room number had been called did not make it. Grief in a hospital is different at night. It feels heavier because there are fewer distractions, fewer people moving, fewer phones ringing, fewer deliveries arriving. The reality of a body cooling in a bed 2 doors down while the world outside keeps sleeping presses in on you. That night, I helped with the quiet tasks afterward, the ones no one likes to talk about, but that someone has to do. The whole time, in the back of my mind, I saw that man sitting calmly in his plastic chair. The next day, I went back to the hospital on my own time. I told myself I was just being thorough, that I wanted to check an old theory I already knew was ridiculous, but I could not shake the feeling that I had seen his face before, not in the hallways, not among visitors, but somewhere flatter, somewhere older. Harborview's main lobby has a wall with framed black and white photographs. Old administrators, notable surgeons, key figures from decades past. I had walked past those faces 100 times without really looking. That day, I stood in front of them and studied everyone. Third frame from the left, second row down. A man in an old-fashioned white coat, arms folded. A stern but not unkind expression. Hair thinner at the top, combed back. Deep-set eyes that looked like they had seen more than anyone should. His name on a plaque underneath, dates of service, years that stretched back before I was born. I stared at that photograph for a long time, counting the small details. The lines around the mouth, the slope of the shoulders, the way his collar sat. My skin prickled with a cold recognition that went beyond logic. I did not say anything to anyone that day. How do you tell colleagues you think you have been seeing a dead surgeon wandering the ER wing? People joke about Harborview legends, but there is a difference between rolling your eyes at an old story and adding your own with that tone in your voice. Instead, I tried to keep an unofficial tally. Nights he appeared, rooms that crashed. I never saw him more than once per shift. Sometimes a week would pass with no sign of him, and I would start to think I had finally shaken the superstition. Then I would round a corner on a quiet, humming hallway, and there he would be, sitting at the end, staring into an empty trauma room, like he was waiting for someone to take that bed. Sometimes, just to test myself, I would check the monitors right after seeing him, even if everything seemed fine. I would walk past each door, listening for the subtle changes and beeps that mean someone's heart is starting to misbehave. More often than not, nothing would happen for a while, but I could never fully relax until enough time had passed without an alarm. The night everything came together was not particularly dramatic at first. Rain again, of course. It always seemed to be raining on the nights I remember most clearly. I was tired in that deep way that seeps into your bones after too many shifts in a row, but not more than usual. The city lights in the windows looked like smudged stars. Around 3 in the morning, I was in the small medication room near the junction of our hall and the ER corridor. It was a cramped space with tall cabinets, a computer, and a narrow counter where we prepared meds. The overhead light was harsher in there than in the hallway, reflecting off every stainless steel surface. A small window in the door let me see part of the corridor behind me, but most of my awareness was on the shelves and labels in front of me. I was drawing up a dose for one of our more fragile patients, double-checking the order, doing the little safety rituals that become second nature: right patient, right drug, right dose, right time. The monitors out beyond the door were beeping in their usual loose pattern, not yet urgent. Something made me glance at the glass of the medication cabinet in front of me. The reflection was small and warped by the slight imperfections in the glass, but there was no mistaking him. Behind me, in the slice of hallway visible through the open door's window, the silhouette of an elderly man sat in a chair at the far end. He was turned toward the trauma rooms again, shoulders hunched just slightly, head angled in that familiar way. My hand stiffened around the syringe. For a moment, the sound in the room dropped away. The hum of the lights became a high, thin whine. The smell of alcohol and plastic grew sharp. I watched the reflection instead of turning around, as if the glass might be more honest than my eyes. He did not move. The hallway looked drained of color behind him, the harsh lights making everything except his figure blur into a pale tunnel. I watched as his head tilted just slightly, like he was listening to something I could not hear. Then, slowly, he turned his face toward the glass. In the reflection, his eyes seemed darker than they ever had in person. The old-fashioned cut of his hair and the collar of his coat were more obvious at that distance, as if the cabinet glass filtered out some of the hospital's modern noise and left just him. His mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into a faint expression of recognition. The overhead speaker chimed. In the reflection, I saw the double doors at the end of the corridor fly open. The reflection showed motion, people rushing, equipment flashing, the bright white of a crash cart. At the same time, in the real space behind me, the noise surged. Voices shouting room numbers, the rattle of wheels, the escalating alarm of a monitor going from concerned to panicked. I could not move for a second. I stood there with a syringe in my hand, staring at the ghost of a dead surgeon in a cabinet reflection, while somewhere down the hall a very real patient's heart betrayed them. Then training took over. I set the syringe down, stepped out of the medication room, and joined the living. Even as I ran toward the code, I felt the weight of his gaze between my shoulder blades. I did not look back. I already knew what I would see if I did. Either that empty plastic chair rocking slightly, or nothing at all. Neither answer would have helped the person whose alarms were screaming. We did everything we could. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is not. That night, it was not. I still work nights, but not at Harborview anymore. I transferred to another hospital a couple of years after all this, for reasons that looked good on paper. Different unit, better hours, closer to where I live now. I never told them that part of my motivation was wanting a building whose walls did not recognize him. But medicine is medicine, and hospitals are hospitals. The fluorescent hum is the same, the disinfectant smell, the late-night elevator dings. On certain shifts, when the hallways get too quiet and the windows show a city that looks half asleep and half forgotten, I feel a familiar tightening in my chest. Sometimes, when I am in a supply room or a medication room with a reflective surface, I catch myself glancing at it before stepping back out. It has become a reflex I cannot unlearn. Check the glass, scan the end of the hall. I've not seen him again, not clearly, not like those nights at Harborview, but once, on an especially long shift when the rain wouldn't stop and the codes were coming one after another, I thought I saw a hunched figure at the far end of a different corridor, just for a heartbeat, just at the edge of vision. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe he is tied to that one hospital. Maybe he is tied to that trauma wing, that hallway, those chairs. Or maybe people like him are just what happens when a place holds too much of the same moment. Breath here, heartbeat there, and then nothing, over and over for decades. Maybe he is not a warning so much as a record, a way the building keeps score. I used to think I would feel better if I could prove he was real, if someone else would see him and say, yes, that man from the photograph sits at the end of the ER hallway at 3 a.m. Now I am not sure. Knowing for certain that he is there, walking the same fluorescent paths, would not change what happens when the alarms begin to sound. So instead, I pay attention. When the monitors are steady and the halls are quiet, I still catch myself glancing down long corridors toward whatever doors anchor that floor. I listen to my instincts, even when they don't make logical sense. If my skin crawls walking past an empty waiting area, I walk a little faster. If I have the sudden urge to check on a patient, I check, even if their last vitals looked perfect. Because I learned something on those Harborview nights. Sometimes the line between life and death is not just written in numbers and charts and lab results. Sometimes it is written in the way the air feels, the rhythm of the beeping, The way an old man you recognize from a 40-year-old photograph chooses a chair at the end of your hallway and sits down to watch. If the dead started using your work radio, how long would you keep punching the clock? That question stopped being hypothetical for me somewhere between Capitol Hill and Westlake, in a stretch of tunnel where the signal dies and the dark presses in on the windows like a living thing. My name is Ruben, and until a couple of years ago, I ran trains on the Link Light Rail. People think it is a boring job. Same route, same tunnels, same stations, over and over. There is some truth to that. You learn every curve by feel, every slight change in pitch where the wheels meet the rail. You can tell when something is off long before a sensor says so, just from the vibration humming up through the floor into your feet. That familiarity is what made what happened in the tunnel between Capitol Hill and Westlake so hard for me to rationalize away. If you have never ridden through that section late at night, it is hard to explain how different it feels from the rest of the line. Above ground, even on a quiet night, there are streetlights and buildings, and the glow of other lives. Underground, once you leave the platform lights behind, all you get is a stuttering sequence of dim tunnel fixtures flashing past the windows, and brief, distorted smears of graffiti that look like they were painted in another world. Your phone dies to no service halfway between stations. Conversations get softer or stop entirely because people become aware of how enclosed they are. From the cab, it is even more isolating. You are sealed off from the passengers by a door. Your world shrinks to the panel in front of you, the tracks ahead framed by the windshield, and the radio on your left. The tunnel lights rush toward you in a predictable rhythm. You feel the gentle dips and climbs, the shifting weight of the train as it takes a curve. It becomes almost meditative on long shifts. The first time I heard the scream, I thought it was just a bad joke. It was a little after midnight on a weekday, late enough that the cars were half empty, early enough that we were still running every 10 minutes. I had left Capitol Hill Station, the platform sliding away behind me as the train eased into the tunnel. The hum of the motors deepened as we picked up speed. The tunnel lights began their usual beat. Dark, light, dark, light. Each flare of fluorescent white skimming across the side of the cab. I checked my speed, glanced at the status lights, then let my attention settle into that strange split focus you develop on the job, half on the track, half on the soundscape of the train, the air conditioning, the faint rattle of something loose in one of the cars, the occasional squeal when a wheel hit a microscopic imperfection. The radio clicked softly in its cradle. That is normal. There's always some background chatter. Dispatch calling out delays, maintenance coordinating, other operators checking in. Usually it is boring. That night, there was a burst of static that snapped my focus tighter. Then, clear through the distortion, I heard someone screaming. It was not a startled yelp or an angry yell. It was a full, raw-throated scream that sounded like it had been ripped out of someone. It went on for maybe 2 seconds, long enough for my brain to stop treating it as a glitch and start processing it as a human sound. Then it cut off with a crackle. "Train. Who was that?" Another operator's voice came through, a little shaky. "Dispatch. Did you hear that?" someone else asked. I grabbed my own mic. "This is northbound out of Capitol Hill. I heard it. You got a source on that?" There was a pause, the kind that is too long to be just someone moving a hand to a button. "Stand by," dispatch said. Their voice sounded wrong to me, not calm and bored like usual, but tight. A few seconds later, they came back. "All operators, we're checking the logs. Continue as normal. Report any further anomalies." Anomalies. That word stuck with me. By the time I rolled into Westlake, people on the platform were looking around, faces turned toward the ceiling speakers. I could see it in their expressions. Some of them had heard it too, faintly through the car speakers. A couple glanced toward my cab as if I might make an announcement explaining it all away. We were told later that night it was an old recording that somehow played through the wrong channel. A corrupted file, someone said, in that vague way people use when they do not really know what they are talking about. That did not explain why nobody would say what the recording was from. It also did not explain the timestamp. I did not see that until a few nights later. There is a trick you learn as an operator. The system logs more than you might think, and some of it is visible if you know where to look. I'm not supposed to talk about the specifics, so I will keep it general. Just know that I was not hacking anything or doing something dramatic. I was just curious and a little stubborn. What I found made my skin go cold. The scream had a time tag, like every other piece of audio that goes through the system. That tag matched, almost to the second, a recorded emergency from years earlier, a derailment in that same stretch of tunnel during testing, before the line ever opened to the public. It was the kind of incident they do not advertise. A test train, minimal crew, a freak mechanical failure, one fatality. Internal reports only. I had heard rumors, like everyone who works long enough around rail yards and tunnels, but I had never seen anything official. The log made it very clear. The scream we heard that night was identical to one captured on the radio during that derailment. Same waveform, same duration, same time of night. Only the date was different. I told myself it must be a morbid training clip someone accidentally queued up, or a file left in the system that glitched. I tried to believe that. For about a week, it worked. Then I started seeing the figure. It was subtle at first, a sense of movement just beyond the wash of the tunnel lights. You get that sometimes. Your eyes picking up shadows from support columns, reflections off damp concrete, graffiti shapes drifting past too fast to read. You learn not to flinch at every flicker. But this movement was different. It was at a consistent height, always near the right-hand side of the tunnel as I headed north, just outside the arc where the external lights made things clearly visible through the windshield. Too tall and narrow to be a maintenance box, too upright to be a trick of the shadows. One night, halfway between Capitol Hill and Westlake, I thought I saw an arm, something pale, just for a split second hanging by a side. The rest of the figure was swallowed by the dark as we roared past. My hands tightened on the controls. I told myself it was just the reflection of my own sleeve in the glass. The system is not supposed to let anyone walk in the tunnels while trains are running. There are strict protocols. When maintenance is down there, trains are stopped or rerouted. There are cameras, sensors, all the things meant to keep human bodies away from high-voltage rails and tons of moving steel. Still, a week after that first glimpse, I filed a report. I kept it clinical. Possible unauthorized person observed in tunnel between stations. Right-hand side, northbound, approximate midpoint. Recommend inspection. I did not mention that the hair on the back of my neck had stood up, or that the temperature in the cab had felt like it dropped 5 degrees for a moment. Maintenance took it seriously. They always do when it is about track intrusions. A day later, I got a short acknowledgement that crews had inspected the area and found anomalies. That word again. I cornered one of the track guys I knew in the break room a few nights later. I will not repeat exactly what he told me, but here's the gist. They found footprints. Not clean, perfect prints, like in a movie. Just scuffs and marks in the dust along the side walkway where no one was scheduled to be. The spacing suggested a human stride, not an animal. Some of the marks overlapped older ones, like someone had walked that narrow path multiple times. Worse than that were the scorch marks on the third rail housing. If you do not know much about trains, here is all you need to understand. The third rail is not something you mess around with. It carries enough power to stop your heart in an instant. It is shielded and marked and kept well away from where anyone should be walking without explicit permission and gear. The maintenance crew found blackened streaks along the edge of the housing as if something or someone had grabbed it. Not a tool. Tools leave patterns. These marks were irregular, more like the uneven pressure of fingers. There was no record of any recent arcing incident in that section. No tripped breakers, nothing. The guy finished telling me this, then tried to laugh it off. Probably some old welding scars we missed, he said. His eyes did not match his voice. After that, every trip through that tunnel felt different. The routine was gone. I would feel my shoulders bunch up as the train left the relative safety of the station lights. The radio would crackle, and I would flinch. The tunnel lights would whip past, and in the gaps between them, the dark looked thicker, almost textured. Sometimes I would swear I could hear something just a fraction out of sync with the train's usual noises. A faint, dragging sound under the screech of the wheels, quickly swallowed by the echo. I started talking more on the radio than I used to, checking in with dispatch, confirming signals. It grounded me, hearing other human voices. But even that stopped feeling safe eventually. The second scream came on a night that had already been bad. Delay at one station, a minor medical emergency in a car that held us up at another, some drunk guy pounding on the doors after they closed. My nerves were frayed by the time I eased into the Capitol Hill platform for what felt like the 100th time that week. We left the station, descended into the tunnel, and the signal bars on my phone. Yes, operators check their phones even when we shouldn't, dropped to nothing. The city overhead faded. Just me, the train, and the long concrete throat ahead. The radio was quiet at first, then static, then a sound like someone breathing too close to a microphone. I reached for the volume knob. The scream tore through the cab. It was the same voice as before, I was sure of it. Same pitch, same roughness, but this time it went on longer. The raw panic in it made something in my chest twist. I could hear other operators reacting, their voices overlapping on the channel, but under all of it was a realization that made my hands go cold. I knew exactly where in the tunnel this was happening. I could feel it in the way the train vibrated, the slight curve we were in, the pattern of the lights. The scream from years ago had not just replayed. It was playing in the same place, at the same point along the line. The idea that sound could be pinned to a physical location like that made me feel suddenly very small in the cab, like the train was not the one in control down there. That night, after we finally got back on schedule, dispatch came over the radio with a tight official statement. All operators, we are experiencing intermittent audio playback issues on the line. Engineering is investigating. Please report any further incidents. There is no danger to trains. No danger to trains. They did not say anything about the people inside them. I started dreaming about the tunnel. In the dreams, I was always walking along the side walkway, far from any safety lights. The third rail hummed beside me, an invisible presence. The train would come, its headlights washing over me, and just as I raised my arm to shield my face, I would realize I was not the one in the cab. I was on the track. I would wake up with the phantom feel of concrete under my palms and the taste of metal in my mouth. The sightings of the figure got clearer. One night, as I headed north, I saw it again in the narrow slice of tunnel illuminated by the external lights ahead. This time, there was no mistaking it for a trick of graffiti or an odd shadow. It was a person-shaped form walking along the right-hand side, parallel to the train. The posture was wrong, too stiff, like someone forcing themselves forward one step at a time against invisible resistance. As we drew closer, the lights caught the side of its head. For an instant, I saw what looked like skin that had been burned, glossy and pale where it should have been matte. Then the figure passed into the darkness behind us, and all I had was my own reflection in the windshield, eyes wide and mouth slightly open. I reported it again. Maintenance went down again. This time they found fresh scuffs in the dust where there should have been none, and more scorched patches on the rail housing. One of them joked nervously about getting a tunnel walker who did not understand voltage. No one laughed. What finally broke me was not another scream from the past. It was a scream from the future. It was a slow Sunday night, the kind of shift that should have been easy. Fewer people, fewer problems. The air above ground had that cold clarity we get here sometimes, the kind that makes the city lights look sharper. Underground, it felt even more like being cut off from everything. I was almost grateful for the tunnel as I left Capitol Hill. The routine of it, the familiar rumble, the way the external lights marked the distance like ticks on a ruler. I could feel the small changes in grade under the wheels, knew without looking exactly how many seconds to the next cross passage. The radio was quiet. Too quiet. No idle chatter, no updates, just a low hiss. Then I heard my own voice. It took a second to register. At first, it sounded like any other operator, a little tinny and flattened by the speakers. But the cadence, that was mine. The way I clipped certain words, the way I exhaled at the end of a sentence. I felt my hand hover over the mic controls without touching them. "Dispatch, this is northbound in the tunnel. I've got," the recorded version of me said, and then the scream ripped out of the speaker. It was me. Not just the voice, but the exact intonation, the way a shout breaks at the top when you don't have time to think about how you sound. It went on too long. I felt the muscles in my throat tighten in sympathetic reflex, like my own body remembered making that sound even though I knew I never had. The cab felt smaller than it ever had. The tunnel lights seemed to slow, flashing past in drawn-out intervals. My own real-time breathing got loud in my ears. For a heartbeat, I had the disorienting sensation that I was hearing a recording of something that had not happened yet. The scream cut off. Silence pressed in, heavy. "Ruben, you there?" A live voice from another operator cut through. "Man, that sounded like you. You messing with us?" "I didn't key anything," I said. My own voice shook slightly. "That wasn't me." "Dispatch, confirm source," I added, forcing my tone flatter. Another too long pause. "We're still seeing this as an audio artifact tied to an old file," Dispatch said. "All trains continue. Report any system malfunctions." An old file. My name had not been on any old file until that moment. By the time I reached Westlake, my decision was made. I finished my shift. I brought the train back to the yard. I did my checks. Then I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and realized my hands were still trembling. I lasted 2 more weeks. You do not just walk away from a job like that overnight. There are procedures, notices, schedules to juggle. I told my supervisor I needed out of tunnels. They offered me different routes, maybe some yard work. I shook my head. The idea of being anywhere near those tracks, near that section of concrete throat between Capitol Hill and Westlake, made my stomach turn. Eventually, I quit outright. On paper, it reads like burnout. Long shifts, stress, the usual reasons. I let people believe that. What I do not tell them is that in those last 2 weeks, every time I took a train through that tunnel, I was waiting for my body to catch up to a sound I had already heard. I kept expecting some catastrophic failure. Some moment where the wheels left the rail, or the lights went out, or the radio crackled, and I realized, too late, that I was about to become the source of the recording we had all been hearing. That did not happen. I never derailed. No train I operated ever did. As far as the official records are concerned, the only incidents in that tunnel are the ones from before my time. But sometimes, late at night, in a different job far from any tracks, I will be in a place where the lights flicker in a steady rhythm and the floor vibrates under my feet from something passing outside. For a moment, my body thinks I'm back in that cab. I half expect my radio, now just my phone, to hiss and play back my own voice in a panic I have not yet felt. I do not ride the light rail much anymore. When I have to, I time it so I am above ground for as much of it as possible. If I find myself on a train that is about to dive into that tunnel between Capitol Hill and Westlake, I get off and wait for the next one, even if it makes me late. People roll their eyes when I tell them I am just not a fan of underground sections. They joke about claustrophobia. I let them. It is easier than trying to explain that somewhere under the city, in a concrete tube lined with flickering lights and old graffiti, The past and future got their wires crossed on a third rail, and for a few long nights, the dead and the not yet dead shared a radio channel with me. How far would you go to prove a house has a room it should not have? For me, the answer was far enough that I stopped trusting what my own windows were showing me. My name is Gray, and this started because I was broke and stubborn and tired of paying dorm prices. The student rental I found near the university district was the kind of place you only take if you are 20, tired, and optimistic. The porch wood was soft and spongy in places. The railing wobbled if you leaned on it, and something in the walls scratched at night in a way that sounded too organized to be just pipes. But the rent was cheap. It was walking distance from campus, and the landlord promised the important things worked. Heat, hot water, locks. The first time I noticed the extra window, I thought it was just me miscounting. I was standing on the sidewalk across the street waiting for a bus, watching my own house the way you do when you're still getting used to it. The siding was a tired, peeling beige, the kind that always looked a little damp even on dry days. 2 windows on the ground floor, 3 on the second, 1 above the porch, 2 on the far side. I traced them with my eyes, matching them to the rooms in my head. Living room, kitchen, upstairs, my bedroom, the other bedroom, the weird little office with the slanted ceiling. But there was a 4th window up there. It sat between where my bedroom window should be and the one that belonged to the other room, but slightly off-center. Narrower than the others, tucked under the eave in a way that made it easy to overlook. The glass looked duller, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. A bus rumbled up behind me, its headlights briefly flaring across the facade. In that flash, I was sure I saw grime on the inside of the glass, not outside. My bus pulled up. I got on, rode to campus, and told myself old houses shift. Sometimes the outside doesn't match the inside perfectly. Maybe I had misjudged where my room sat relative to the facade. I had only been living there a week. That night, lying on my mattress, with the faint bass from some party down the block thumping through the walls, I mentally walked through the house. My room had 1 window, over the porch. The other bedroom had 1 window overlooking the side yard. The tiny office had a window you couldn't even fully open because the frame had warped. I'd opened every one of them at least once to try to air out the smell of old carpet and dust. 3 windows upstairs. Not 4. The thought nagged at me for days. Whenever I came home after dark, the sodium streetlight out front threw everything into that sickly orange glow. The rain in Seattle doesn't always pour. Sometimes it just hangs in the air as a mist that fogs up bus windows and makes the pavement slick. I started watching my own house from inside those bus windows, my face ghosting over the glass, counting. 2 ground floor, 3 upstairs, and then my stomach would tighten when my eyes snagged on the 4th. It always looked the same, dim, no light behind it, no curtain, just a dull square of darkness. I tried to forget about it. Classes were heavy. My roommates had their own problems. We had mice or rats, something in the walls that clicked and scrabbled late at night like tiny fingers running along the studs. The landlord dropped off cheap traps and shrugged when we mentioned it. "Old house," he said. "They were here before you." Then one afternoon I came home early while it was still light and decided to prove to myself I was being stupid. I walked through every upstairs room with a notebook and a ruler I'd borrowed from a friend who did architecture. It felt silly, measuring walls like some wannabe inspector, but the more I tried to dismiss the feeling, the stronger it got. My bedroom first, 12 feet from inner wall to wall with the window. I wrote it down. The next bedroom, 11 feet plus a closet. The office, 8 feet. I sketched a crude rectangle for each room, marking where doors and windows sat, where the hallway cut through. When I drew all 3 rooms side by side in my notebook, with the hallway accounted for, there was a gap. A weird, narrow gap between my room and the other bedroom that didn't line up with the hallway, the closets, or anything else. A gap about 3 feet wide. A gap that would be right behind that 4th window. Once I saw it on paper, it was like something in my brain clicked and refused to unclick. I could not stop thinking about that slice of space. It was not big enough to be a full room, but too big to be just old house weirdness. I tried to bring it up casually with my roommates. "Do you ever feel like the upstairs layout is off?" I asked one night, over cheap takeout at the wobbly kitchen table. They shrugged. One of them joked that the house was trying to eat us, then asked me to pass the hot sauce. Nobody wanted to analyze it. We were all tired, and the sound of rats, or whatever they were, scuttling behind the kitchen cabinets was a more immediate problem. That should have been the end of it. But curiosity, once it gets its teeth into you, feels a lot like hunger. I started looking up old property records online. Late at night, with rain streaking the small window over the kitchen sink and the glow of the streetlight casting a pale rectangle on the peeling linoleum, I dug through badly scanned PDFs on my laptop, plat maps, permit records, grainy black and white photos of the house from decades ago. In the oldest photo I could find, the house looked cleaner, but unmistakably the same. 2 windows downstairs, 3 upstairs, no fourth. In a photo from the 80s, you could see 4. No record of a renovation permit between those dates mentioned adding a room. It bothered me how easily I slipped into obsessiveness. I started timing my walk so I'd pass the house from different angles. From the alley, you couldn't see the extra window. It only showed from the front. From the side, if you craned your neck just right, you could glimpse the edge of the frame, half swallowed by siding. The more I tried to ignore it, the weirder the house felt. The scratching in the walls got louder near the part of the hallway where that hidden gap should have been. I'd be brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom, fogged mirror in front of me, and I'd hear something behind the plaster. Scritch, 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 followed by a faint thump, like something testing the barrier. Sometimes, late at night, when the parties down the street had finally died down and the whole block was mostly quiet, I thought I heard something else layered under the usual rodent noises. A softer, slower scrape, spaced out like someone dragging nails carefully across wood. One Saturday, when both my roommates were gone for the weekend, the feeling finally overran my common sense. The house was extra quiet. Outside, a drizzle blurred the world, and the occasional bus hissed by, its windows fogged, silhouettes of students pressed against the glass. The porch boards creaked under my feet when I stepped out to look at the facade one more time. 4 windows, upper floor. I stared at the 4th until my eyes watered. Back inside, I stood in the upstairs hallway, right where the gap should be. On one side, my bedroom door. On the other room. Between them, a stretch of wall maybe 3 feet wide, blank except for cheap frame posters someone before us had left behind. I took it down. The wall there sounded different when I knocked. Not hollow like a stud bay, not solid like brick. A dull, muffled thud, like there was something on the other side soaking up the sound. I knew logically that smashing a hole in a rental wall was a bad idea. Security deposit, angry landlord, all of that. I also knew that if I didn't, I was going to keep waking up at 3 in the morning thinking about that space, hearing phantom scraping sounds. I started with a small hole, just enough to peek through. I used the back of a hammer, feeling both ridiculous and weirdly adrenalized. The drywall gave way easier than I expected, crumbling into dust that smelled stale and old in a way the rest of the house didn't. Behind it was insulation, brittle and discolored. I pulled it aside. The smell that hit me then was different. Not the damp, moldy scent of old houses, but dry dust and something else. A faint, stale odor like fabric that had been shut away for years. I widened the hole, careful not to cut into any wiring. When it was big enough, I shined my phone flashlight through and looked. There was a room, narrow but longer than I expected, running along the front of the house. The 4th window was there, its inside frame coated in grime, light from outside barely filtering through. The beam of my phone caught floating dust motes and what looked like the edge of a small mattress on the floor, stained and collapsed in the middle. The walls were painted a pale color that might once have been cheerful, but now looked like old bone. On the wall opposite the window, there were marks. At first, I thought it was cracked paint. Then I adjusted the angle of the light and saw the grooves. Long, parallel gouges running vertically and diagonally, clustered at about the height of a person's reach. The paint was torn down to the plaster in places. In some grooves, there were darker streaks I did not want to identify. For a long moment, I just knelt there, breathing through my mouth, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it was in my throat. The house creaked around me in the way old houses do, but the creaks sounded closer, like they were coming from inside the walls instead of the rafters. I could have stopped right there, called the landlord, pretended I had discovered some weird sealed storage area, let someone else deal with it. Instead, I kept going. I widened the hole enough to squeeze through. The drywall scratched my shoulders as I pushed into the hidden space. Inside, the air felt still, like a closet no one had opened in a decade. The dust on the floor was thick. My footsteps left clear prints. The mattress in the corner sagged, springs pushing up through thin fabric. A small metal-framed bed, no sheets, just the bare remains of a pad. On the floor next to it lay a single shoe, small like it belonged to a kid. It was tipped over, its laces gone. I turned toward the wall with the gouges. Up close, they were worse. Some ran in frantic clusters overlapping. Others were slow, deliberate lines dragged down over time. I raised my own hand experimentally, lining my fingers up with the grooves. They matched. For a second, my brain offered me a benign explanation. Maybe someone kept a dog in here, some anxious animal that scratched to get out. But the lower parts of the wall were cleaner. Most of the damage centered around shoulder and head height for a human. I backed away, my phone light shaking a little. In the far corner, something glinted faintly. I moved the light. A small bracket screwed into the wall with a frayed length of fabric attached, like something had been tied there once. I got out of that room as fast as I could without actually running. Crawling back through the hole felt like squeezing out of somebody else's memory. Back in the hallway, my own house looked wrong. The doors too close together, the ceiling too low. I covered the hole with the poster and tape, hands moving mechanically. I did not want my roommates to see it. I did not want to have to explain. I did not want to say out loud that someone had once been shut into a hidden room in our house and had clawed at the walls until their fingers bled, or worse. That night, the scratching in the walls sounded worse, more frantic. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, watching the glow of the streetlight trace faint lines on the cracked paint, listening. Somewhere between the two bedrooms, the sound gathered. Scritch, 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 thump. Scritch, 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 thump. Over and over, like a pattern someone couldn't stop repeating. I moved out as soon as I could. I told my roommates only that I'd found a place closer to campus, that my schedule made the walk annoying. They rolled their eyes, but they let it go. I packed my stuff and tried not to think about the poster-covered section of wall, or the mattress, or the way the extra window never had any light behind it. My new apartment was across town, in a bigger building with bland beige hallways and fire doors that all looked the same. It was ugly in that way only student housing can be, but it felt normal. No soft porch boards, no constant scratching in the walls, no fourth windows to count. On my first night there, I went for a walk to clear my head. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets damp and reflective. Cars hissed by. Somewhere nearby, people were laughing, music pulsing faintly behind closed doors. When I came back, I stopped on the sidewalk to look up at my building. It's a dumb habit, but after the house, I wanted to orient myself. 4th floor, 3rd window from the stairwell. That was mine. That was when I saw it. On the face of my new building, 1 floor above mine, there was an extra window, just one, narrow and a little off-center, set into a section of wall that, as far as the floor plan was concerned, should have been solid. No balcony, no unit marked there on the directory downstairs. The glass looked dull, like it hadn't been cleaned. No curtain, no light. For a long time, I stood there on the wet sidewalk, the smell of damp concrete and exhaust in my nose, listening to the city. Headlights passed, reflecting off the building, briefly brightening the empty glass. In one of those flashes, I thought I saw something on the inside of that extra window. Not a person, not a clear shape, just a faint vertical smear on the glass, like something had dragged down it from the inside with steady, desperate pressure. I tell myself I imagined it. I tell myself old houses have secrets and new buildings have quirks, and that sometimes your brain just can't let go of a pattern once it thinks it's found one. But I've moved twice since then, and everywhere I go, there's a moment, usually when I'm standing on the street looking up, when I count the windows and feel my stomach drop, because there it is again. One extra pane of glass that shouldn't be there, blank and unlit, watching me back. Most people picture Lake Union as pretty. Purple sky, houseboat lights, seaplanes fading into the distance. That's the version you see on postcards. The version I remember is the one where the water went flat around my kayak like glass, and I realized I was not the only thing moving on that surface. My name is Dane, and on paper that evening should have been perfect. It was one of those Seattle days where the rain finally gives everyone a break in the late afternoon, leaving the air washed clean and a little cool. I'd had a long shift downtown, screen glare still burned into my eyes, and all I wanted was to get away from traffic, offices, and people talking too loudly on phones. Kayak rentals on Lake Union are the obvious answer for that. You pay your fee, sign your waiver, and they hand you a plastic boat and a paddle like they've just given you permission to disappear for a while. I went alone. That wasn't unusual. Couples and groups take the double kayaks and shout at each other about who's not paddling enough. People like me take the singles, angle toward the houseboats, and pretend we live simpler lives than we do. When I pushed off from the dock, it was still light enough to see the ripples from other boats, the bright kayaks snaking out toward Gasworks and Portage Bay. The rental guy made a joke about me bringing the boat back before dark, then turned away before I could answer. I took that as a yes. You're fine. Go do your thing. I pointed the bow toward the cluster of houseboats along the shoreline. There's something strangely calming about drifting near other people's tiny floating homes, smelling dinner through open windows, hearing fragments of conversations that don't involve you. The city hum was still there, the low roar of I-5 not far away, the occasional honk from a bridge, but it felt muffled by distance and water. The sky shifted as I paddled. Day blue drained into a deeper purplish tone, the kind you only really notice when you're outside and still for longer than your commute. The first lights blinked on along the shore, kitchen windows, strings of bulbs on decks, a neon sign across the way flickering to life. Their reflections wobbled on the lake's surface, ribbons of yellow and white stretching and breaking with each small wave my kayak made. Out in the center channel, bigger boats moved slowly, respectful of the smaller craft. Their engines left a faint smell of gasoline and exhaust on the wind that mixed with the sweet green stink of algae. Every few minutes, a seaplane's distant call would echo from somewhere toward the north, then fade, leaving the steady hush of water against hulls. I fell into a rhythm, pull, drip, my paddle dipping and lifting, tiny whirlpools forming and vanishing around the blades. My shoulders loosened. My mind finally started to unclench from the day. I don't know exactly when I first heard the other paddle. At first it was just more noise. Small splashes behind me, the kind that could be anything. Another kayak, a paddleboarder, a bird landing. This is a busy lake. You're never truly alone out there. I didn't think much of it. I just shifted slightly to the right to give whoever was behind me space, the way you would on a bike path. The sound stayed with me, though. Same distance, same rhythm. When I sped up, it seemed to keep pace. When I paused and let my boat glide, the splashing behind me went quiet for a heartbeat, then resumed when I did. I glanced over my shoulder, using the excuse of adjusting my grip to make it look casual. Behind me, The water stretched out in ripples and faint reflected lights. Farther off, near the middle of the lake, a couple of kayaks moved in a cluster, their hulls bright orange and red. Closer in, near me, there was no one. I turned back around, frowning a little. Sound on water travels weird. It bounces, distorts. Maybe what I was hearing was just someone else's paddle echoing off the houseboats, arriving in my ears delayed. That made sense. I forced myself to accept that and kept moving. The noise came back. This time I listened more carefully. There's a difference between the way a beginner paddles and someone who's done it a lot. Beginners slap at the water, uneven strokes, splashes too big, boat veering side to side. Confident paddlers move smoother rhythms, more pull than splash. What I was hearing behind me wasn't either of those. It was wrong. Each sound was a little too sharp, like the paddle blade was hitting something more solid than just water before it dragged through. I tested it. I veered closer to the houseboats, then farther out, changing my angle. The sound adjusted with me, staying at that invisible point just behind and to the left, where my peripheral vision couldn't quite reach. By then, the light had changed more. The sky was slipping from purple to navy, and the city lights were taking over. The Space Needle glowed off to one side, its reflection broken on the lake. The big windows of apartments facing the water turned into glowing rectangles. On the shore, someone laughed loudly. Someone else shouted for a dog. Those sounds made everything feel normal enough that turning fully around to confront whatever was behind me felt dramatic, overreacting. I didn't want to be the guy spinning his kayak in circles at dusk, glaring at empty water. So I told myself to relax. I watched the bow cut through the lake, watched the tiny waves fan out. I focused on the physical things, the small burn in my arms, the cool air on my face, the way the kayak rocked gently but predictably. When the handprint appeared, I told myself it had been there the whole time. I noticed it because my paddle bumped the side of the boat on a sloppy stroke, smearing a bit of green slime where it hit. Swearing under my breath, I glanced down to check how much of a mess I'd made. That was when I saw the mark, just above the waterline, on my left. It was the size of a hand, maybe a little smaller than mine, but not by much. 5 streaks of darker green algae ran downward from a thicker, smudged oval. The shape was unmistakable once my brain locked onto it. Palm and fingers. Like someone had grabbed the side of the kayak from the water and dragged their hand down as they slipped away. I stopped paddling. The boat rocked gently, carrying its own momentum forward. The water around me flattened, small waves settling into a faint, glassy sheen. Behind me, the phantom splashing stopped completely. I leaned over as much as I dared, peering at the handprint. It looked fresh. The algae smear was thick, still wet, not yet diluted or washed away. There hadn't been anything on the hull when I launched. I remembered the rental guy shoving it toward the water, the smooth white plastic scraping the dock. I would have seen this then. My mind went practical first. Maybe I'd brushed too close to a buoy or a floating log covered in slime. Maybe I'd clipped the side of a houseboat and not noticed. Maybe I was freaking myself out because I'd been seeing missing person flyers all over the neighborhood lately. The same face printed on cheap paper, taped to power poles and cafe windows. That thought came uninvited, but once it was there, it brought company. Those flyers had a photo of a person about my age, maybe younger, smiling stiffly like the picture had been cropped from something casual. The dates under the face marked weeks since they'd gone missing. People had stuck little candles and flowers under one of the flyers near my bus stop. I'd walked past them every day, hardly looking, until one morning I'd caught my own reflection in the glass behind the paper and flinched at how much more solid I looked than that printed face. I shook myself a little, trying to clear that image. The lake around me had gone noticeably quieter. The slap and murmur of other paddles, the low thrum of motors, the distant calls from shore. They were still there, but dimmer, like someone had turned the volume down on everything beyond a certain radius. I realized I could hear my own breathing more clearly than before. I told myself to start paddling again. Sitting still in the middle of a lake at dusk, staring at a slimy handprint, was only going to make my brain worse. I dipped my paddle in. The water pushed back against the blade like usual, but the sound it made was muted. The small whirlpool that spun off the end spread out, then seemed to slow more quickly than it should have, its motion damped down. I took a few more strokes, aiming back toward the rental dock, deciding I'd had enough peace for one evening. Behind me, maybe 10 seconds later, came that other paddle sound again. Same sharp, offbeat shove. Same distance that my eyes couldn't quite catch if I turned only my head. I kept my gaze forward, trying to ignore the tightening in my chest. The houseboats slid by on my right, their decks now lit with warm domestic light. A TV flickered in one window. In another, someone was cooking, the hood fan venting out a faint smell of garlic. That normalcy should have been comforting. Instead, it made me feel weirdly exposed, like I was moving through a lit stage while whatever was behind me stayed in the wings. Something bumped the hull, gently but firmly, near my left hip. Not the soft, random nudge of a small wave, but a thud, like someone had pushed the boat with the heel of their hand. My heart crawled up into my throat. I looked down at the water beside me. From above, with the last of the light and the city glow, the surface read mostly as black with streaks of color. But the closer your eyes get to it, the more you can see down into that murky green-brown. Tiny bits of debris floated, leaf fragments, pollen, an occasional scrap of who knows what. My own reflection looked back at me, warped by ripples. Pale, elongated, eyes too dark. I forced myself not to lean too far. I forced myself to keep my paddle moving, slow strokes, so I wouldn't tip in my own panic. Another nudge, this time near my right foot. "Hey," I muttered, to no one in particular. My voice sounded flat, small against the open air. I don't know who I was talking to. The lake, myself. The idea of solid physics. That was when everything around my kayak went still. It didn't make sense. I could see out beyond my little bubble the typical chop of Lake Union, waves from other boats, wind patterns, the disturbed path of a distant seaplane that had landed earlier. But within maybe a 10-foot circle of my kayak, the water flattened. The rocking stopped. The bobbing, gentle motion of being on a lake ceased so abruptly that my balance shifted, like standing on an escalator that suddenly freezes. The paddle dipped in. No ripples radiated beyond that invisible boundary. It felt like stirring a bowl of thick liquid, not open water. My brain, desperate to make this about something normal, offered up words like oil slick, weird current, temperature inversion. I clung to them even as I knew they didn't fit. I could have kept my eyes on the horizon. I could have stared at the rental dock lights, the shoreline, the safe yellow shapes of street lamps, and just paddled blindly until the hull scraped home. That would have been the smart move. Instead, some awful magnetic urge made me look down again, this time more directly. At first, all I saw was my own distorted reflection and a faint greenish haze. Then, as my eyes adjusted and my brain filtered out my face, another shape resolved underneath. It was pale, not glowing or dramatic, just lighter than the surrounding water. An oval, slightly tilted, with darker hollows where eyes should be. It was closer to the surface than made any sense. Maybe a foot down, held there with an unnatural stillness. No bubbles, no movement, just a face looking straight up at me. The features were wrong in that they didn't read as drowned decay or anything cinematic. They looked preserved, almost like a photo underwater. Hair floated around the head in slow, cloud-like tendrils. The mouth was closed. The eyes, in that awful refracted way water gives, were wide and focused. Recognition came a half-second later. I had seen that face every day for weeks on paper, on poles, in shop windows, At the bus stop I used after work. The missing person flyer. Same jawline, same too-straight smile, now erased. The water flattened and warped some of it, but I knew the way you know your own reflection. For a moment too long, I just stared back. My body locked up. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to move, to tip the kayak away, to paddle like hell. Another part held me there, pinned, like some unspoken agreement had finally been called in. You wanted to know what was behind you, here it is. The eyes below the surface flicked slightly. Not much. Just a tiny shift that proved this was not a trick of shadows or debris. They tightened, almost like squinting against bright light. Against me. The handprint smeared on my hull seemed to darken. It was a terrible illusion, probably just my vision adjusting, but it felt like watching fresh algae being pressed there from underneath. That broke whatever hold the moment had. I yanked my paddle through the water so hard I nearly lost it. The kayak lurched forward, the bow lifting a little as I overcompensated. The flatness around me rippled reluctantly, like something thick being forced to move. I didn't look down again. I didn't look behind me. I fixed my eyes on the dock lights and paddled in a straight, desperate line, muscles burning, lungs tight. Sound rushed back in slowly. First the hum of the freeway, then the distant bass from someone's boat party, then the normal slosh and lap of water. By the time the rental dock came close enough for me to hear voices, the lake felt ordinary again. I hit the side of the dock harder than I meant to. The rental guy grabbed the bow, steadying it, giving me an annoyed look that softened when he saw my face. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied, voice rough. "Just tired." I scrambled out, knees wobbly. The dock felt strangely solid after the unreal stillness out there. I told myself to look at the kayak casually, to confirm the handprint was just slime from some gross log. The smear was still there, unmistakably palm-shaped. The streaks had dried a little at the edges, but in the center, the algae was fresh and thick, like someone had pressed up from below only minutes before. "You must have gotten real close to something," the rental guy said, following my gaze. "We hosed that one off like an hour ago." I forced a non-committal noise, signed my return form with a hand that didn't feel like mine, and walked up the ramp to the street. The smell of gasoline and algae clung to me all the way to the bus stop. For weeks after, every time I passed one of those missing person flyers, I'd feel my stomach twist. The city took some of them down eventually. Rain blurred others into runny paper ghosts. A few stayed up longer, the ink fading, the face becoming a suggestion more than a person. I have not rented a kayak since. I still go near the lake sometimes. It's hard not to. It's part of the city's center of gravity. From the shore, watching other people paddle out at dusk, their boats bobbing on the purple-blue water, it all looks harmless. Peaceful even. The reflections of houseboat windows ripple. Seaplanes drone overhead. The freeway hum never really stops. But whenever someone jokes about how creepy it would be to tip over in the middle of Lake Union at night, or how deep it must be out there, I don't laugh. I picture that still pale face suspended just under the surface, waiting in that narrow band between light and dark. And I know that if I ever went back out there alone, at dusk, in a rented kayak, I would feel that flatness around me again, the moment when all the normal movement of the water stops. And I'm not sure I would have the strength to look away a second time if something reached up from my boat. Most people who ride the last bus home convince themselves the weird stuff is just coincidence. Wrong place, wrong time, random stranger. That's what I told myself too, right up until the night I realized the man in the back of my bus didn't exist in the glass. My name is Charlie. And for almost a year, my life ran on closing shifts. The schedule was always the same. Lights off, register counted, trash out, door locked, bus stop. If you live and work downtown long enough without a car, you get used to the late-night routes that feel half forgotten by the city, still running because someone, somewhere, has to get home. My line out to Ballard became a tunnel of yellow light and wet windows, a moving room that felt more familiar than my own apartment. It always started the same way. I'd step onto the bus with my bag slung across my shoulder. The doors hissing shut behind me and the smell of damp coats, old vinyl, and faint gasoline wrapping around me. The overhead lights were that tired yellow that makes everybody look a little sick. Outside, rain streaked the glass and smeared the street signs into unreadable neon smudges. The automated voice would chime, "Route to Ballard," in that weirdly calm tone that never matches how people feel on it. The bus was never empty, but it was rarely full. A few people scattered in ones and twos. Someone sleeping with their head against the window, someone scrolling a phone, someone staring straight ahead like they were trying not to think about where they were going. The kind of crowd where everyone pretends they're alone. And, after a while, the man in the very back. The first time I noticed him, he didn't register as anything different. Just another late-night rider, sitting in the rear corner seat, where you can see almost everything but nobody really sees you. He faced forward, hands resting on his knees, shoulders slightly hunched like his coat was too heavy. I didn't stare. You learn not to. I took my usual seat near the middle, right side, where I could watch the city slide by and still keep an eye on the doors. We went through the same sequence of stops, up Third, past the bars, and the people spilling out to smoke under awnings, the voice overhead announcing street names in that steady cadence. Doors hiss open. A couple of people get on. One gets off. The light from outside flickers across the faces inside, turning everyone into moving shadows as we pass each intersection. At some point, I looked back down the aisle. He was there, still in that back corner. Same posture, staring straight ahead. No bag, no phone, nothing in his hands. Just sitting. Something about the way he seemed disconnected from the small bus drama. A dropped card, someone arguing quietly on their phone, made him stand out, but only a little. I got off at my usual stop in Ballard, pulled my jacket tighter against the drizzle, and didn't think about him again until a few nights later. He was there again. Same bus line, similar time, different driver. The bus was a little fuller that night, people damp and irritated from heavier rain. I grabbed a different seat this time, closer to the front. When we pulled away from downtown and the bricks and glass turned into smaller storefronts and quieter streets, I glanced back. Same coat, same seat, same forward stare. People have regular routes, I told myself. You do. Why can't he? Maybe he worked late, like me. Maybe the back seat was his version of my middle right spot. People are creatures of habit, especially on transit. Still, when we reached Ballard and I stood up to get off, I watched him out of the corner of my eye. The bus stopped. The doors hissed. A couple of people brushed past me and stepped out into the rain. I scanned the front of the bus. No movement from the back. The driver closed the doors, pulled away. As the bus rolled forward, I craned my neck just enough to see through the side window. He was still there, a still shape in the rear corner, not standing, not reaching for the cord, just going wherever the bus went after my stop. After that, I started noticing him more often. Not every night, but often enough that it felt like a pattern. Closing shifts, last bus. Same man in the back. He never seemed to get on at the same stop. I'd board, and he'd already be there. Or he'd appear a few stops in when the bus was crowded enough that I might have missed the exact moment. I never saw him stand up. I never saw him press the stop strip. He was simply part of the bus, like the seat, or the pole, or the faded route map behind the driver. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was coming from one of the earlier stops downtown, where I didn't always see who got on. Maybe he rode farther than me, out past my stop, to some late-night job or a couch in Crown Hill. Maybe he transferred back downtown again for all I knew. The human brain is good at stitching maybe over things that don't quite line up. What I couldn't rationalize was the way he felt when you looked at him. Have you ever stared at someone's reflection first because you're too embarrassed to look at them directly? On buses at night, the windows turn into mirrors. You see your own face, the person across from you, and behind them a ghosted version of the rest of the bus. It's how you check who's behind you without turning around like a paranoid person. One night, the bus was running late. The city outside the windows had that neon-smeared look. Bar signs, glowing red and blue, puddles acting like little mirrors. My eyes were tired, so instead of watching out the window, I watched the reflections in it. The driver's silhouette, the row of hanging straps, the blurred faces of people behind me. I could see the woman across from me, nodding off. Behind her, a guy in a hoodie scrolling his phone. Behind him, further back, a shape that should have been the man in the corner. But there was nothing. I blinked, leaned just slightly to adjust the angle. The real aisle, when I glanced sideways, showed him clearly. Back seat, right side, head tilted the slightest bit down as if he were looking at the floor. In the glass, in the exact spot where his head should have been hovering above the row of seats, there was an empty patch. I could see the outline of the seat back, the pole, even the smudge of an old ad sticker on the window frame behind him. No trace of a person occupying that space. My stomach went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the damp air. I told myself, reflections are weird at night. Angles, double-layered glass, the way interior and exterior light compete. Maybe the reflection just wasn't catching him right. Maybe he was sitting at an angle that made his dark coat blend perfectly with the shadows. I shifted again, pretending to adjust my bag, trying to line up the real aisle with the ghost one in the glass. Same result. Everyone else behind me ghosted in the window, pale and translucent. The corner seat showed an impression of emptiness where he sat in reality. I jerked my eyes away, suddenly very aware of my breathing. The automated voice announced another stop in that cheerfully detached tone. The doors hissed open, letting in a gust of air that smelled like wet pavement and fry grease from a nearby takeout spot. 2 people got off. 1 got on. The driver's radio crackled briefly, a burst of sound that made everyone's head twitch just a little. I thought about getting off early and walking the rest of the way home. It would have meant 20 minutes in drizzle, but my skin was crawling in a way that made staying on the bus feel worse. I didn't move. Habit is a powerful thing. So is the fear of looking like you're overreacting in public. The bus rolled on. The bars thinned out, replaced by darker storefronts and residential streets. My stop crept closer. I told myself not to look again, that whatever was happening at the back of the bus was not my business, that I could step off, go home, and forget about it like any normal person. Of course, I looked. I waited until we were slowing for my stop. Then, as casually as I could manage, I turned my head, pretending to glance toward the rear door. The corner seat was empty. No coat, no hunched shoulders, no still profile. Just worn blue vinyl, a faint ring of moisture on the fabric where someone with a damp jacket might have been sitting, and the bus window behind, streaked with rain. I hadn't heard anyone stand up. The bus hadn't stopped between the last time I checked, and now, the space where he should have been felt wrong, like when you walk into a room someone just left and the air hasn't decided what temperature it wants to be yet. I got off, heart pounding, eyes flicking automatically to the rear window as the bus pulled away. In the glass, lit from inside by the same old yellow bulbs, I thought I saw a shadow shift deep in the back, like someone leaning forward slightly to watch where I went. Maybe that should have been the point where I stopped telling myself it was coincidence. Instead, I did what most people do. I compartmentalized. Long day, weird light, imagination. I went home, microwaved something I barely tasted, and convinced myself that going to sleep would reset everything. It didn't. Over the next week, the bus and that back corner seat started to occupy more space in my thoughts than my actual life did. I noticed myself timing my walk to the stop so I would arrive just a few minutes before the bus, not early enough to stand there, staring down the route. When it pulled up, I'd hesitate for a fraction of a second on the stairs, bracing myself, then step on and scan. Some nights he was there, some nights he wasn't. On the nights he wasn't, the ride felt almost disappointingly normal, like a suspense movie where Nothing jumps out for 10 minutes, and you start to relax against your better judgment. On the nights he was, the bus felt smaller. I began to notice details I hadn't before. When he was on, the air in the back half of the bus seemed cooler, a thin draft brushing along the floor. People rarely sat near him. They'd pick seats closer to the middle even when the rear was technically emptier. The few times someone did sit in the last row, it was never directly next to him, always leaving a one-seat buffer, like they were unconsciously avoiding that exact space. I watched him in the reflection whenever I could bring myself to. Always the same vague outline in real life. Always that same blank spot in the glass. Sometimes, when the bus hit a bump or took a turn, everyone's reflections would sway and jostle, faces blurring. His absence stayed perfectly still. The night I decided to walk back there was the night the driver spoke to me first. It was a later run than usual. My manager had kept us extra long for inventory, so by the time I reached the bus stop downtown, the usual flow of people had thinned to a few clusters under the shelter. The bus rolled up, brakes sighing. I stepped on, flashed my card, and glanced toward the back. He was there. Of course he was there. I took my usual seat, feeling the familiar little sag of the cushion. The windows wore their usual vertical lines of raindrops. Bars and neon signs on Third threw red and blue streaks across the glass as we pulled away. The automated voice recited the upcoming stops. Everything looked normal enough that for a few minutes I managed to lose myself in my phone, scrolling through nothing important. At some point, the bus turned onto a quieter stretch. The crowd thinned. I put my phone away and stared out at the wet sidewalks, trying not to think about the fact that the man in the back had not, to my knowledge, moved once since I'd gotten on. As we slowed for a light, I felt the driver's eyes on me in the mirror. It's something you pick up on when you ride a lot, the way they check on disturbances or make sure someone looks okay. "You ride this one late a lot," the driver said, voice carrying back just enough over the engine hum. "Yeah," I answered. "Closing shifts." He nodded, eyes flicking back to the road. "Crowd changes after midnight," he said, almost to himself. "Different kind of regulars." I made a non-committal sound. Part of me wanted to ask if he saw the man in the back, but even forming the question in my mind made me feel ridiculous. "Ever freak you out?" he added, tone light but not quite joking. "Being one of the last ones on?" "Sometimes," I admitted. He gave a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been nothing. The light turned green. The bus rolled on. I don't know if it was that little exchange or just the accumulated unease of too many almost incidents, but something in me snapped past curiosity into a kind of stubbornness. If I was going to keep riding this route, I needed to prove to myself that the man in the back was just that, a man, a real person who would look up and get annoyed if I bothered him. So when we passed the stop before mine, when it was late enough that only a handful of us were left on board, the bars giving way to clusters of dark houses and the glow of the occasional all-night place, I stood up. My legs felt heavier than they should have as I turned toward the back. The aisle stretched longer than usual, each pole another tiny decision point where I could turn around and sit down again. I walked anyway, the bus's slight sway pushing my shoulder gently into one rail, then the other. As I passed the last set of side-facing seats and the very back row came fully into view, I realized three things at once. First, the corner where he always sat felt colder. Not dramatically, no visible breath or frosty windows, just a subtle, biting coolness that seeped through my jeans as I got closer. Second, the overhead lights seemed dimmer back here, like someone had swapped the bulbs out for weaker ones. The yellow had a gray tinge. Third, the seat was empty. No coat, no hunched figure. Just the vinyl, darkened in a perfect person-shaped patch, as if someone damp had been sitting there minutes earlier. On the window beside it, the condensation was thicker than on the other panes, fogged almost completely. I stood there, gripping the nearest pole, feeling foolish and unsettled all at once. The bus bounced over a pothole. I swayed and caught myself. The driver didn't call back to ask what I was doing. The few remaining passengers stared straight ahead, wrapped in their own invisible bubbles. I told myself to sit down, to laugh this off internally, to chalk it up as proof that my brain had been turning an ordinary guy into something else. I shifted sideways to slide into the empty corner seat. That was when I saw my name. In the fogged-over condensation on the window, directly above the darkened seat, someone had traced letters with a fingertip. Not deeply, not theatrically, just enough to make thin, clear lines where the moisture had been wiped away. 5 letters, slightly crooked, exactly as I scribble them when I'm rushing. My name. It looked fresh. Tiny droplets clung to the edges of the letters. I hadn't written it. No one else on the bus should have known it, unless they'd memorized it off my name tag at work, and even then the timing and placement made no sense. Behind the blurred glass, the night outside smeared by rain, I thought I saw a darker shadow move close, as if something were standing inches from the other side, breathing lightly on the pane. The bus jolted as we pulled away from a stop. The motion broke whatever trance I'd slipped into. I backed away from the seat slowly, my eyes locked on those wet, shining letters, until I was far enough down the aisle that the angle hid them. I didn't sit again. I stood near the rear door, hand wrapped too tight around the pole until the automated voice announced my stop. When the doors opened, I stepped down into the puddled light, heart hammering. I almost didn't look back. Almost. The bus pulled away in that smooth, practiced acceleration. Through the back window, glowing with that jaundiced interior light, I could see the last row of seats. For a second, the glass reflected only my own street and the red taillights. Then, as the bus turned, the angle shifted just enough. In the very back, in that corner seat, a darker patch coalesced. A head. Shoulders. Facing forward again, as if he'd been there the whole time and I had just chosen the wrong moment to look. I went home in a fog. The walk that usually took 10 minutes felt like 30. The sound of car tires on wet asphalt followed me. Every bus that hissed past on another line made my shoulders tense. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those letters bleeding slowly down the glass, water gathering at the bottom of each curve before dripping away. The next evening, I thought about taking a different route. There are ways to get to Ballard that don't involve that bus, if you don't mind transfers and extra time. But my feet took me to the usual stop anyway, like habit had more authority than fear. When the bus arrived, it was the same driver as the night before. I got on, tapped my card, and hesitated. The driver looked at me, then at the mostly empty cabin, then back. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough that it didn't carry far. "Yeah," I said automatically, then heard myself add, "Just weird stuff on buses sometimes." "Right." He gave a small, humorless smile. "You could say that." Impulse pushed me further. "Do you ever get people who ride all the way and never get off? Like, same person, over and over." Something in his expression shifted. He glanced in the mirror, as if checking who might be listening, then back at me. "You notice a guy in the back, quiet, doesn't pull the cord?" he asked. The hair on my arms prickled. "Yeah." He sighed through his nose, fingers tightening on the wheel for a second. "Some routes get regulars," he said. "Some keep them longer than others." I waited, pulse loud in my ears. "Years ago," he continued, eyes mostly on the road now, voice even. "Before my time, but I heard about it. There was a man who rode this line late every night, sat in the back like that. One night, no one noticed he'd stopped breathing. They found him at the end of the run, still sitting upright. Heart just gave out somewhere between downtown and Ballard." He paused long enough that I filled in the rest before he said it. "Ever since," he went on, "some drivers say they see someone back there on the late trips. Never hits the stop, never talks, just rides, usually no trouble." He glanced at me again. "Until he takes an interest." I swallowed. "What does that mean?" "Most folks don't notice him," the driver said quietly. Or if they do, they forget by morning. But every now and then, he latches on, picks one person, sits behind them night after night, follows their stop for a while, far as he can. Little things start happening. Cold seats, names in the fog. My skin crawled at that. Look, he added quickly, maybe seeing my face. Stories get exaggerated. Guys in the depot like to spook each other. I've never seen anything I can't explain. He hesitated, then conceded. But there are nights I check the mirror, and I'd swear there's one more body back there than shows up in the camera feed. I thought about the missing reflection, the empty seat in the glass, my name traced on a window I hadn't touched. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you look like someone who started connecting dots, he said. And sometimes the only way people stop seeing him is by changing something. Route, schedule, routine. The bus slowed for my stop. The automated voice announced the cross street as if nothing in the world was wrong. You can stay on if you want, the driver said softly. But you might think about mixing it up for a while. I stepped off into the wet night. The doors closing behind me with their familiar hiss. The bus pulled away, lights glowing, windows flashing with reflected signs. For the first time in months, I didn't watch the back to see who might be looking out. I walked home a different way, cutting down side streets I usually avoided, just to feel like I was the one choosing the path. The rain soaked my hood. Neon from a bar sign bled into a puddle at my feet, red and blue smearing into purple. I still ride buses. In a city like this, you can't avoid them forever. But I changed shifts. I rearranged my commute. If I have to head toward Ballard late, I check the time and the route number twice, sometimes 3 times before I step on. And whenever I sit near a window at night and the glass fogs up enough that I could draw in it with a fingertip, I keep my hands in my pockets. If my name's going to show up there again, I don't want there to be any chance it was me who wrote it. Most people imagine cabin fear as creaking floors and banging doors. What actually gets you is when the snow outside is smooth and perfect, and you can still hear something walking circles around your walls. My name is Louisa, and the cabin above Snoqualmie was supposed to be the quietest place I had ever stayed. I booked it because I was tired of city noise seeping into every thought, sirens, neighbors, garbage trucks at 6 a.m., and I needed a place where my brain had no excuse not to focus. The listing showed a small A-frame tucked into tall pines, a narrow road climbing away from the freeway, and one photo taken from a ridge looking back toward Seattle. The skyline just a faint row of teeth on the horizon. Perfect winter riding retreat, the description said. I believed it. The drive up already felt like stepping out of my own life. Wet asphalt gave way to slushy shoulders, then to patches of snow on the trees that got thicker the higher I went. The sound of the city faded into the steady rush of the highway. Then that dropped away too when I took the exit and started climbing into the foothills. By the time I turned onto the last unplowed lane, the only sounds were my tires crunching over packed snow and the occasional thump of wet clumps falling from branches. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the photos, which felt honest instead of disappointing. One room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, a table, and a narrow staircase up to a loft bed. The lights were dim and slightly yellow, the kind you get from bulbs that have been in their sockets a little too long. When I shut the door behind me, the quiet folded in like a blanket. No neighbors, no road noise. Just the sigh of the wind through the pines and the faint creak of the cabin settling. That first afternoon, the silence felt like a relief. I unpacked slowly, stacking my notebooks and laptop on the table, lining up pens with a care that bordered on ritual. Outside, snow fell in lazy, fat flakes, the kind that drift rather than slam into the ground. Every now and then, a gust of wind would shake the cabin and rattle the one big front window. I made coffee, watched my breath puff faintly in the chilly air before the stove warmed things up, and told myself this was exactly what I needed. Night came early, like it always does in winter, but up there it felt more sudden. One moment the trees were dim shapes, The next, they were black cutouts against a sky the color of iron. When I stepped out on the small front porch to bring in more wood, the snow squeaked under my boots and the air hit my lungs like something solid. My breath streamed white in the beam of my headlamp. The nearest other light was far below, a distant amber glow that might have been a farmhouse or a road. Farther still, if I turned my head just right and squinted past the trees, I could see the faint smear of Seattle on the horizon. A reminder that the world was still out there, even if it felt very far away. I went to sleep that first night thinking only about how I was going to structure my writing the next day. The sound woke me up. It took a second to place because at first it threaded itself into whatever dream I'd been having. A soft, rhythmical crunch, crunch, crunch like someone walking over fresh snow. Not heavy, not stomping, slow, deliberate. It circled the cabin, moving along one wall, rounding a corner, then along the next. I lay there in the loft, staring into the darkness, the low ceiling just above my face, and listened. Wind can make weird noises in trees, branches knocking, trunks groaning, snow sloughing off. But this wasn't that. There was a pattern, a pace, step, 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 slight pause, step, step, step. It moved past the front door. The sound deadened for a moment by whatever overhang the porch gave, then picked up again along the side. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, nosing around the cabin, or a coyote, or something smaller wandering in a wide loop. The idea that it might be a person hovered for a second, and then was pushed away. No car had come up the road after mine, and the snow out there was deep enough that you'd hear anyone flailing through it. The sound completed its circuit and faded. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again. When it didn't, I forced myself to relax, stared at the faint outline of the skylight above the loft until my eyes got heavy, and eventually fell back asleep. In the morning, with light leaking around the edges of the curtains, it was easy to chalk it up to nerves. First night in a strange place, brain on alert, nothing more. I pulled on my boots and jacket and stepped outside, more to reassure myself than anything else. The snow around the cabin lay pristine and smooth. No tracks near the walls, no disturbance except for my own footprints from the evening before, already softened by the new dusting that had fallen overnight. The surface looked undisturbed all the way out to the tree line, where the wind had sculpted small drifts against trunks. I walked a slow circle, watching for any sign that something had walked there. Nothing. The powder near the foundation stayed even, as if no weight had pressed it down. I even crouched to touch it, half expecting to find some harder crust under the surface that might have hidden impressions. My fingers sank in easily, cold seeping through my gloves. Back inside, I laughed at myself, but it was a thin sound that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. Daytime made it easy to forget again. I worked for hours at the table, the glow from my laptop screen mixing with the dim cabin lights. The stove crackled quietly. Sometimes the wind would gust, and the whole place would creak, the boards shifting in their fittings. Once, during a break, I stepped outside and listened. The world was a soft hush of falling snow and muffled forest. The city's distant smear on the horizon had vanished behind clouds. That night, the footsteps came back. I woke up faster this time, heart already beating a little faster, as if my body had been waiting for the sound even in sleep. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Around the cabin, same pace, same slow, unhurried loop. This time, I slid out of the loft bed and down the narrow stairs, trying not to make the boards groan under my feet. The main room was angled with weird shadows from the stove's dying embers. The windows were black rectangles. I flicked on the porch light and opened the front door. Cold punched me in the face. The cone of yellow light fell across the front steps and a small slice of the snow beyond. The surface glittered untouched, tiny crystals catching the light. No tracks. The sound had stopped the second my hand touched the doorknob. I stood there, one bare hand gripping the cool metal, the other holding the doorframe, and listened. Wind in the pines, the faint tick of the stove cooling behind me. Nothing else. I stepped out just far enough to lean past the corner of the cabin and look along the side. The snow there was undisturbed, a smooth sheet right up to the wall. No animal had walked here. No person had circled my cabin, unless they walked in midair. Back inside, with the door shut and the porch light off, the darkness felt thicker. I lay awake for a long time before sleep finally came in restless, shallow stretches. The next morning, there was something on the porch. At first, I thought it was just debris blown in from the woods, a small pile of twigs or pine cones. But when I opened the door, I saw it clearly. 5 small rocks, each about the size of a walnut, stacked in a neat little column by the doormat. They weren't from the gravel of the driveway. They were rounded river stones, gray and smooth, dusted with snow. The stack was too deliberate to be an accident. The top stone was balanced just slightly off-center, like someone had taken the time to fuss with it until it sat the way they wanted. I looked out at the snow again, scanning for footprints or disturbed patches. The steps were clear except where I had walked. Beyond that, the snow lay unbroken. No drag marks, no holes where someone might have knelt or leaned. I brought the stones inside because leaving them there felt like accepting something I wasn't ready to name. I set them on the table and stared at them while my coffee cooled. They didn't make me feel better in the house. They made it feel like outside had followed me in. By the third night, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Sleep, footsteps, silence when I looked, rocks on the porch in the morning. The second stack was different from the first. 7 stones this time, arranged in 2 small pyramids side by side. The third was a ring. Each time, no tracks. The isolation that had felt comforting at first started to press on me. During the day, the heavy snow muffled everything. I could shout from the porch, and my voice would be swallowed by the trees. At night, the wind wove through the pines with a low, moaning sound that sometimes hid the crunch of the invisible steps until they were almost under my window. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was an animal clever enough to step exactly in its own tracks. Maybe the snow crusted over at night just enough to disguise prints by morning. Maybe some bored local kid had decided to mess with the city person in the rental cabin. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the sky finally cleared enough that I could see farther. From a small rise just behind the cabin, I found the view from the listing photo. The hills rolled away in soft white waves, the pines dark against them. Far, far in the distance, the faint glow of Seattle's skyline floated over the horizon, almost invisible in the bright air. Seeing it should have been reassuring, a reminder that civilization was still out there. Instead, it made me feel how thin the connection was, like a frayed string stretched too far. That evening, as the light faded and the cabin's interior took on that dim, flickering quality from the stove and the old bulbs, I decided I'd had enough of not knowing. I'd brought a cheap motion-activated camera with me, intending to film wildlife if I saw any. Instead, I mounted it above the front door, angling it to catch the porch, the steps, and as much of the snow in front as possible. The little indicator light blinked once when I turned it on, then went still. "Let's see you," I muttered under my breath, more to myself than to anything outside. Saying it out loud made me feel faintly ridiculous, but it also made me feel less like I was just waiting to be surprised again. That night, the footsteps were louder. I woke up to the same crunch-crunch, but closer somehow. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind, and for a moment I couldn't tell what was the building and what was outside. Then I realized the pattern of the steps had changed, still circling but occasionally pausing right under the front window for a beat that felt longer than necessary, like something was stopping to listen. I didn't rush downstairs this time. Instead, I lay there in the loft, heart hammering, every muscle tense, counting the passes. 1, 2, 3, around the cabin. The wind gusted, rattling the branches. On the 5th pass, the steps slowed right under the front door. Snow pressed against the bottom of the frame with a soft hiss. The cabin lights flickered. Just once, a quick dip and surge, as if something had drawn power for a heartbeat and let go. The stove glowed a little dimmer, then steadied. I'd never been so aware of being alone. Eventually, the steps pulled away, fading into the general noise of the wind and the groaning trees. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, staring at the faint light from the stove, listening for more, until the gray of morning seeped around the edges of the curtains. On the porch, the stones were back. This time they were arranged in a line, directly in front of the door, evenly spaced. There were 8 of them, each one set in a shallow depression as if dropped from a small height. The snow around them was otherwise untouched. My hands shook as I took them inside. I spent half the morning talking myself out of packing up and leaving early. The roads might be icy. The forecast said more snow later. The whole reason I'd come up here was to be away from distractions. How ridiculous would it be to go back now because something in the dark was playing games with rocks and footsteps? Around midday, when the light was brightest, I finally pulled the memory card from the motion camera and plugged it into my laptop. The footage was mostly nothing. Clips of me going in and out, the porch light toggling on and off, the edge of my shadow moving across the frame. A squirrel once, darting past in a blur of fur and tail, snow falling in the beam, lit like static. Then a clip, time-stamped around 3 in the morning. The porch was still. The light I'd left on cast a pale circle on the steps and a slice of the snow beyond. In the distance, past the edge of the frame, I could see the faint glow from the cabin's front window, flickering slightly. At first, nothing happened. I leaned closer to the screen, watching for even a hint of movement at the edge. No figure stepped into view, no animal trotted past. The snow in front of the door remained a flat, undisturbed plain. But the camera had been triggered by something. I turned up the volume. At first, all I could hear was the faint, ever-present rush of wind. It hissed against the microphone in tiny pops of static. Under it, the wood of the porch creaked occasionally, a small, familiar noise. Then slowly, another sound rose out of the background. Breathing. It was close, too close. Not coming from the direction of the cabin, but from somewhere just off-frame near the camera itself. Slow inhales and exhales, the faint rasp of air moving through a throat. Whoever, or whatever, was making that sound was standing near enough that the microphone picked it up more clearly than the wind. On the screen, the porch remained empty. No shadow crossed the steps. No outline formed on the snow. The breathing grew slightly louder, as if whoever it belonged to had taken a half-step closer. My own breath hitched in response, syncing up without my permission. The cabin window in the background flickered again, dimmed, brightened. For a heartbeat, every light inside dipped low, like someone had thrown a sheet over the whole building and then yanked it away. On the audio, there was a faint, wet sound, like a tongue clicking against dry lips. I paused the clip, my hand clammy on the trackpad. The frozen image showed nothing out of the ordinary. Just the porch light haloing a small section of snow, the cabin in the distance, its glow steady again. I advanced frame by frame, eyes straining. In one frame, the snow looked perfectly smooth. In the next, a small depression appeared in the middle of the light. Then another, a few inches away. Then another. By the end of the clip, 8 shallow indentations dotted the snow in a line in front of the door, the exact positions where the stones had been sitting when I stepped out that morning. No hand, no foot, no body ever moved into view. The stones simply appeared one by one, as if they had been carefully placed by something standing just outside the camera's vision. When the clip ended, the audio cut back to pure wind. I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence of the cabin turn into something else. The heavy snow outside muffled any noise from far away, but inside every small sound seemed magnified. The tick of the cooling stove, the tiny crackle of the wood, the creak of a board when I shifted my weight. I looked at my packed notebooks, my half-finished drafts on the screen, the small stacks of stones now lined up on the table like punctuation marks I didn't know how to read. The sensible thing would have been to leave, pack up, brave the road while there was still light, put distance between myself and whatever watched that cabin at night. I grabbed my keys at least twice with that intention, then set them down again. Some mix of stubbornness and fear of driving those snowed-in roads in a rush held me there. I compromised. I told myself I would stay one more night, but I wouldn't be there alone in the way I had been. I texted a friend back in the city, a half-joking, half-serious message about being creeped out in a snowed-in cabin. No signal. The little sending icon spun and spun, then gave up. The last light of day slipped away. The sky went from pale gray to dark blue to almost black. The distant glow on the horizon where the city should be never really emerged. Clouds had rolled back in, hiding even that thin connection. I left the motion camera where it was, pointed at the porch. I turned on every light in the cabin. The bulbs hummed faintly, casting overlapping circles of yellow. When the footsteps started that night, they didn't circle right away. They approached. Crunch, 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 from somewhere out in the trees, growing slowly louder. The cabin walls felt thinner with each step. When the sound finally reached the invisible line around the cabin, where the snow always stayed undisturbed, it seemed to slip sideways, moving around the perimeter. This time they paused at every window. I could hear the weight of presence shift, boards creaking where there was no reason for them to. The wind outside gusted, but the tempo of the steps stayed separate, like a second pulse overlaying the first. The cabin lights flickered again, once, twice. On the third dip, the stove flared, then calmed. I didn't go to the door. I didn't go to the window. I sat at the table, hands flat, eyes fixed on the stones lined up in front of me, counting my own breathing to drown out the sound of someone else's. I left the next morning, digging my car out with numb hands, tires spinning in the packed snow until they finally found purchase. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a second, in that small rectangle of reflected world, I thought I saw the faint impression of a figure standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing, just beyond where the snow showed any tracks, not moving, just watching. Back in Seattle, surrounded again by sirens and buses and other people's lives, it would be easy to convince myself I'd overreacted. The footage could be corrupted, the breathing a glitch, the stones a prank. The mind fills in gaps, especially in isolation. But sometimes, late at night, when the apartment quiets and the distant city hum drops to a low murmur, I'll hear the building creak and feel that old pressure in the air. On those nights, I find myself looking at my own walls and windows, counting the steps between them, wondering if something that never leaves footprints in the snow needs snow at all to circle whatever it's chosen. Some places feel crowded even when they're empty. Pike Place, after dark, is like that. Lights off, stalls closed, and somehow it still feels like the building is waiting for you to turn your back first. My name is Casper, and for 4 years I had keys to almost every locked door in Pike Place Market. My job title sounded simple enough: maintenance. In reality, it meant I was the one who came in after the last tourist left, after the last bucket of fish got hauled away, and made sure the whole creaking maze would still function the next day. I checked pipes and breakers, tightened loose bolts, and coaxed ancient rolling doors into behaving for one more morning. If you've never seen the market after hours, it's hard to explain how different it feels when the crowds bleed out and the neon sign glows over almost empty streets. The first time I closed alone, the silence hit me like a wall. During the day, Pike Place's noise layered on noise. Vendors shouting, people laughing, cameras clicking, buskers playing, kids crying, the constant slap of footsteps, and the crash of boxes. At night, once the last stall rolls its metal gate down and the last restaurant wipes its final table, the building exhales. The fish smell doesn't go away. It just hangs lower. The air gets cooler. The neon public market center sign outside burns through fog and drizzle, reflected in puddles and the dark glass of storefronts. Inside, the overhead bulbs flick to half power. Then some areas go black completely, leaving long, echoing hallways with just exit signs for company. I used to like those first minutes of empty. I'd walk the main arcade with my flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the squeak and rattle of rolling doors cooling, the distant hiss of the street outside, the faint thud of waves hitting the seawall below the hill. The stalls looked smaller without people. Hooks hung bare, tables sat uncovered. It felt like catching a performer off stage in plain clothes. Small things started happening before I ever called them hauntings. One night, I locked up a craft stall, a little corner space with trinkets and glass charms. I remember clearly straightening a row of tiny silver hooks on a display board. They all pointed the same direction when I clicked the padlock on the gate. Half an hour later, on my way back from resetting a breaker, I walked past and saw 3 hooks bent at sharp right angles, all exactly the same way, like someone had grabbed them with pliers and twisted. The lock was still latched. The gate hadn't moved. I fixed them, shrugged it off. Metal can flex, I told myself. Maybe my brain remembered them straighter than they were. Then there were the footprints. The lower levels of the market are a maze. Old concrete floors, low ceilings, weird corners that smell like dust and something older. Some nights I'd do my rounds and find a fan left on or a door unlatched, normal stuff. But a couple of times I'd turn into a narrow hallway and find fresh wet footprints on the floor tiles. Bare feet, not shoes, small. They started in the middle of the corridor, went maybe 6 or 7 steps, then just stopped. No smudge at the end where someone might have turned. No trail to a door. By the time I'd fumble my radio out to call security, the prints would already be drying at the edges. No cameras covered those exact angles. When I walked the path myself, my boots left clearer marks than whatever I'd just seen, and they lasted longer. The first time I heard the kids, I assumed they were real. It was a Thursday, one of those long summer days that turn into short nights because people don't want to leave. A family had lost track of time. We'd had to shoo them out of a toy shop 10 minutes after closing. I remember one of the little girls dragging her feet, whining about wanting to see the pig statue one more time. Dad scooped her up and promised they'd come back tomorrow. Hours later, closer to midnight, I was down in one of the old lower corridors, the ones with a mix of antique shops and spaces that feel like they've been empty since the 70s. The air down there has its own temperature, colder than street level, with a hint of old pipes and sea air that never quite dries. I was checking a slow drain when I heard it. Laughter. High, quick, unmistakably, a kid's laugh echoing from farther down the hall, followed by a second, slightly deeper giggle. The kind of sound you hear at the fruit stands all day. Kids cracking up at someone tossing a fish or sticking their face too close to a crab tank. At midnight, in a locked, empty lower level, it didn't belong. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding way too loud to my own ears. "We're closed." "Hello?" The laughter cut off. For a second, all I heard was the soft buzz of an exit sign and the quiet creak of old wood somewhere overhead. I walked toward where it had come from, boots thumping dully on the concrete. Every door I passed was shut and locked, security tags in place, lights off inside. I knew which shops had back exits and which didn't. None of the ones in that stretch opened to anywhere but the hallway I was in. The hair on my arms prickled. I told myself, sound can travel weird in old buildings. A radio upstairs, maybe, bouncing down through vents. Still, that night when I finished, I walked a little faster than usual toward the staff entrance that led back to the street. The layers of history in that place are thick. You can feel them if you spend enough nights there. The market's been open for more than a century. Farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, homeless guys looking for a dry corner, tourists, buskers, kids, everyone circling through the same spaces over and over. You hear stories if you stick around. The vendor who dropped dead behind his stall, the woman who lived above the market and fell down the stairs, the kid who disappeared in the crowd one summer and was never found. Some of it is probably myth. Some of it isn't. I didn't think of my job as scary. Lonely sometimes, sure, boring often, but not scary. I had keys and radios and lights. I knew where the cameras were. I knew which security guards liked to cut through which hallways, so I could angle my routes to bump into them if I wanted human contact. The place had other ideas. It was a wet fall night when things turned from weird to, I'm not being paid enough for this. Rain had been coming down sideways most of the day, blowing off the bay and slamming into the market's exposed edges. By closing time, the neon sign outside glowed through a sheet of mist, each red letter haloed. The fish stalls had washed their floors so hard the smell of bleach fought the usual brine and guts. Water dripped off awnings in steady streams. The last tourists left, hunched under umbrellas, their voices fading into the background noise of traffic and waves. Inside, we did the usual closing dance. Vendors rolled their doors down with squeaks and bangs. Lights clicked off in sections. One of the security guys checked in with me near the main arcade, then headed out to sweep the street level. I took my checklist and started descending. The lower levels felt even more cut off than usual with the storm above. The sound of rain filtered down in muffled whooshes. Somewhere, a drain gurgled under strain. The exposed pipes overhead sweated a little, droplets forming and falling at random. I was halfway down a set of stairs when I heard the children again. This time, it wasn't just laughter. It was the full soundscape of kids at play, running footsteps, a high-pitched voice calling, "Wait up," another hushing it with a giggle. It drifted up from the corridor below, around a blind corner. Every sensible part of my brain told me it had to be someone. A family that had snuck down and gotten turned around. Teens messing around after hours. Sound bouncing from the street. Anything but what it felt like. I took the last few steps slower, boots scuffing. The minute my head cleared the level of the floor, the temperature dropped. Not by a couple degrees, not a trick of damp air, but a solid, breath-stealing cold that bit through my jacket and made my eyes water. The lights in that corridor were on timers. Normally, at that hour, only every other fluorescent tube stayed lit, a pattern of bright, dim down the narrow hall. As I stepped off the stairs, the farthest light flickered, buzzing loudly for a second, then went out. I stopped. Another burst of laughter echoed, closer now, like it was just around the next bend. It sounded wrong in the cold, too clear, too bright, like someone had played a summer sound in a winter room. "Hey," I called, more sharply than I meant to. "You can't be down here. Where are your parents?" No answer. Only the hum of electricity and the distant dull thud of waves against the pilings far below the hill. The next light down the hall flickered. Went out. The corridor was long, with one turn halfway. Between me and that turn, 3 ceiling fixtures remained, casting islands of harsh, buzzing light. I watched the third one blink twice, then steady. My breath fogged in front of my face now, visible in the air. I should have turned around. I should have gone back up, grabbed security, chalked the whole thing up to an electrical problem and some prank. Instead, something like anger, or maybe pride, pushed me forward. This was my building, my job. I wasn't going to be chased out by bad wiring and echoes. I walked toward the next pool of light. My boots sounded too loud. Each step echoed back at me from the concrete and old plaster. The cold deepened as I moved. The second light buzzed louder, then crackled. Went out. Darkness closed in behind me, thick enough that turning back would mean walking into a tunnel with no visible end. Ahead, 2 lights left. One just before the corner, one somewhere beyond that I couldn't see yet. "Last warning," I said, voice deliberately steady. "If anybody's down here, you need to answer. You're not supposed to be in the building." The kids laughed again, right near the corner this time. The sound bounced weirdly, like there were more walls down here than I could see. I reached the last visible pool of light. The cold hit a kind of peak that made my fingers ache even inside my gloves. I glanced back. The light at the top of the stairs, my way out, flickered, dimmed, and went black. The only light left in that stretch was the one over my head and whatever was around the bend. The rest of the market might as well not have existed. The neon sign, the street, the city, none of it reached here now. There was just me, a narrow corridor, and the sound of small feet scuffing somewhere I couldn't see. The fixture above me flickered. That was the moment I thought, you can still go back. You can walk into the dark and keep one hand on the wall, and you will find the stairs again. Then something whispered my name. Not shouted, not moaned. Whispered, like someone a foot from my ear, lips almost brushing skin. Casper. The light over me went out. The dark that dropped was total. Not, my eyes need to adjust dark. Not, dim shapes are still visible dark. This was the kind of black you get when you close your eyes in a room with no windows and bury your face in a pillow. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, faster than the dull crash of the waves far below. The whisper came again, on the other side this time. Casper. There was breath with it. I felt the faintest stir of air against the fine hairs on my cheek. The cold deepened in a ring around my head, like something with no heat of its own had moved close enough to steal mine. Every muscle in my body locked. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For a second, I felt sure that if I exhaled, my breath would hit someone else's face. The kids giggled. Not from down the hall now, but all around me, thin streams of laughter weaving through the dark, above and below, too many directions at once. My hand fumbled for my flashlight. I dropped it. The clatter on the floor sounded way too loud, a metallic explosion in the quiet. The laughter cut off mid-breath. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. No whisper, no hum of lights. Even the ever-present background sounds of the building seemed to hold their breath. Then, one by one, the lights came back. Not in the order they'd gone out. This time they snapped on from behind me forward. A wave of harsh fluorescent buzzing down the corridor, throwing my elongated shadow ahead, like something chasing me even as the light moved past. I bent to grab the flashlight, with hands that didn't feel like they belonged to me. The metal was freezing cold. I didn't bother turning it on. There were no kids in the hallway. No one in front of me. The turn ahead revealed only more concrete, more closed doors, more locked shop fronts. The air was still cold enough to sting my lungs, but the temperature had lifted from the bone-deep freeze of a minute before. I looked down at the floor. There were wet marks on the concrete between my boots. Not footprints exactly, just small, irregular patches, as if droplets had fallen from something standing very close to me. They formed a rough circle around where I'd been. I walked out of that lower level without checking another drain. On my way back up, every creak in the stairs sounded like something following. When I stepped into the empty main arcade and saw the dim glow from the neon sign bleeding in through the front windows, I nearly laughed in relief. The fish smell, the lingering stink of garbage, the damp air, all of it felt suddenly comforting, like the normal messiness of a living place. I finished my shift. It took longer than it should have because I kept skipping certain corridors, choosing routes that stayed as close to the exits and cameras as possible. When I handed my keys in that night, my fingers left a faint tremble in the metal ring. I told myself I'd get over it. One bad night, one weird experience in an old building full of strange noises and stories. The human mind doesn't like loose ends, though, and mine kept picking that night apart, replaying the whisper, the freezing air, the way the lights had gone out in order, like someone was walking along the switches. I lasted 2 more weeks. In that time, the little things got worse. Hooks I straightened would be bent again the next night, always in the same direction. Small displays I'd left perfectly aligned would have one item skewed at a sharp angle when I walked past later, like a kid had bumped it and run. Once, I found every chair in a small cafe pulled half an inch away from their tables, all at once, like someone had walked through and dragged each one with a fingertip. I never heard the kids again clearly, but sometimes, when I was in the middle of some mundane task, changing a bulb, wiping up a spill, I'd catch the thinnest thread of a giggle just at the edge of hearing, like it had slipped under a door from another room. The whisper came back once more. I was in a stairwell, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, concrete cool under my palm. No one else around, at least no one I could see. As I reached for the handle to the landing door, the same voice breathed my name near the back of my neck, just shy of contact. I felt the air stir. I smelled something under the usual mix of fish and bleach and dust, a hint of old damp wood and something sweet, like rotten fruit. That night, I went home, sat at my kitchen table until morning, and wrote my resignation. No dramatic explanation, just personal reasons and a thanks for the opportunity. I got another job not long after, in a part of the city that doesn't have a century of other people's lives stacked on top of each other. My commute changed. I didn't have to walk past Pike Place anymore if I didn't want to. Sometimes I still do. Old habits are hard to kill. On early mornings, when the sky over Elliott Bay is just starting to lighten and the neon sign is still the brightest thing on the hill, I'll cut across the street that overlooks the market and glance down. The stalls will be half set up, vendors hauling crates, tourists not yet swarming. On those days, everything looks normal. People laughing, calling out, living their unhaunted lives. It's at night, if I'm coming through downtown later than I meant to, that I avoid looking. Because on the rare occasions I have when the fog hangs low and the sign glows red through the mist, when the upper levels are mostly dark and only the occasional light burns in a stairwell window, I swear I can hear it again. Not loud, not clear, just under the city's noise. When a bus passes and the sound rebounds off the old brick, I'll catch a high, quick giggle that doesn't belong to anyone on the street. And sometimes, carried up from the market's open side with the smell of fish and seawater, a small voice will ride the wind, close enough that I turn my head without meaning to, because even in a crowd, it feels like someone inches away has just whispered my name. Most people think nightmares stay in the bed you had them in. That's what I used to believe too, until I realized the worst part of my night followed me up a flight of stairs and into every place I slept after that. My name is Alec, and the apartment above the bar was supposed to make my life easier. I'd been bartending there for a while, closing late, then dragging myself home on night buses or in overpriced ride shares. When the tiny studio upstairs opened up, the owner offered it to me cheap. "You'll hate the noise," he said, half joking, "but you'll never be late." I laughed, told him I could sleep through anything. That part turned out to be almost true. The problem wasn't sleeping. It was what happened when I tried to wake up. Capitol Hill at night bleeds into everything, even upstairs, with the windows closed. The bass from the bar below came up through the floorboards like a second heartbeat. The muffled thump, thump, thump shook my cheap glassware just enough to make them click. Colored lights from the bar's sign and the place next door leaked in through the blinds, painting my walls red, then blue, then purple in a slow cycle. Cigarette smoke threaded up through cracks I couldn't see, giving the room a permanent faint haze. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it felt alive. After my first late shift and a few free drinks, I crashed hard. The first time it happened, I thought it was just a bad dream. I woke up with the music still pounding under me, bass rattling the bed frame. My eyes were open. I could see the window, the stripes of colored light on the wall, the shadow of the ceiling fan, but my body refused to move. No matter how hard I tried, my arms stayed welded to my sides, my chest pinned. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through a soaked blanket. I told myself to relax. I'd read about sleep paralysis before, random article somewhere. Brain awake, body still in sleep mode, it passes. Focus on moving a finger, that's what they said. So I dug my attention into my right hand, tried to twitch my thumb. That was when I saw the shape at the foot of the bed. At first, it was just a slightly darker patch in the already dark corner, about where the wall met the closet. Then my eyes adjusted, and I realized it was taller than it had any right to be. A figure standing, shoulders sloped, head tilted forward, like it was looking down at me. No face, not that I could make out, just a deeper black, where a face should have been. It swayed, not randomly, not like a person shifting their weight. It rocked very slightly from side to side, perfectly in time with the bass from below. Thump, lean left, thump, lean right. Each movement tiny, enough to catch the light on its outline. Never enough to step forward. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. My throat locked. Panic crawled up the back of my neck in a slow, cold wave. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. The music from the bar bled into the room. Someone shouting below, glasses clinking, laughter spiking, and then muffling again. Up here, all of that folded into the sound of my own heartbeat and the soft creak of the mattress springs as my body strained uselessly. The figure stayed where it was, swaying, watching. I had the irrational sense that it was waiting for something from me. A reaction, a word, a breath. Then, like someone cut a string, my body popped loose. I bolted upright, lungs dragging in air so fast I coughed. The corner was empty. Just the pile of my laundry, the closet door, the faint smear of colored light. My chest hurt like I'd been holding my breath for minutes. I told myself it was textbook sleep paralysis. Hallucination, heavy chest, the whole cliché. I even Googled it on my phone right there, sitting on the edge of the bed, while the bar's closing track shook the ceiling. Every result said the same thing. Common, harmless, more likely under stress and irregular sleep. That matched my life a little too well. It happened again the next night. Same script. Came off shift wired, showered, fell into bed, listening to the muffled chaos under my floor. Same waking up pinned in place. Same heaviness on my chest. This time, I refused to look at the corner. I stared at the ceiling, at the faint dust on the fan blades, at the way the colored light shifted when someone opened the bar's front door downstairs. Didn't matter. I could feel it. That sense you get when someone's standing too close behind you, that you can't explain except as pressure in the air. That's what it felt like, focused at the end of the bed. The bass thumped through the mattress. Thump, thump, thump. The room felt smaller with every second. I tried the finger trick again. Nothing. My jaw clenched so hard it ached. The creak started softly. A faint, rhythmic whine, like an old floorboard rocking, almost drowned by the bar noise. Creak, creak, perfectly on the offbeat between bass hits. I knew, without looking, that its weight was shifting again, swaying, waiting. When I finally snapped free, I rolled out of bed too fast and hit the floor, cheeks slapping the cold wood. Pain was almost a relief. The corner was empty again. The room smelled like stale beer and smoke and my own sweat. 2 nights in a row was harder to write off. I mentioned the sleep trouble casually to one of the other bartenders during a slow open, keeping the weird details to myself. She shrugged, said, "Yeah, that room's got bad vibes," like she was talking about ugly paint. "What does that mean?" I asked. She hesitated. "Ask him," she said, tipping her head toward the owner at the far end of the bar. I didn't. Not then. Pride, maybe. Or the fear that if I said it out loud, it would get more real. The 3rd episode broke that. It started like the others, but worse. I felt myself sliding into it before it fully hit. A sense of dropping through my own body. Awareness snapping to the fact that I couldn't move seconds before the paralysis locked in. My eyes opened to the familiar ceiling, the shifting colors, the faint haze. The bar's bass was lower than usual. Maybe it was a slower song, the end of someone's set. The figure was already there. No easing in from shadow this time. It filled the corner, darker than the rest of the room. Edges fuzzed like I was seeing it underwater. It stood closer to the bed than before, toes, if it had toes, almost at the edge of the mattress. Swaying, slow and steady. With every rock, the pressure on my chest grew, like the air itself was leaning down. I couldn't even move my eyes away from it. I was stuck staring at that blank face area, that absence of detail. As it rocked, the colored light from the blind slid across where its features should be and disappeared, swallowed. Something buzzed in my ears, not sound from the bar, not the usual tinnitus of too much loud music. A low, static hum, building. Under it, I thought I heard something like words, pressed so close together they turned to texture instead of language. My lungs burned. My body screamed to thrash, to jerk awake, to do anything. The more I fought, the heavier it felt. For a terrible second, I genuinely thought, this is how people die in their sleep, and no one ever knows what it felt like. When I finally tore loose, it was like breaking the surface of a pool. I sat up with a gasp, vision swimming. My heart hammered so fast it made my fingers tingle. The bar below had gone quiet. We were past closing. The silence felt wrong. The next shift, I waited until the owner was counting out the drawer and the other staff had drifted off to smoke or go home. The neon from outside threw a red wash over the bottles behind him. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual and failing. "Weird question. That studio you rented me, anyone ever complain about it before?" He stared at the bills in his hand for a second, then set them down in a neat stack. "Noise. Yeah. Smell, yeah. What kind of weird are we talking?" "Like, not just noise," I said. "Bad sleep. Feeling like someone's in there with you." For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't crack a joke. "The last guy," he said slowly, "worked here too. Lived up there maybe a year. Seemed fine. Quiet. Got more tired toward the end, but who doesn't in this business?" He paused, fingers tapping the wood. "One morning he didn't show up to open," he went on. "Didn't answer his phone. I went up with my keys, found him standing in the corner by the bed, like he was on his feet, but gone. Cops said overdose. Probably took something, stood up, heart gave out. They said the swaying I described was normal, body trying to hang on to balance." My mouth went dry. "Swaying?" "Yeah," he said. "They asked me where exactly. I told them. Same corner the bed's in now." He looked at me properly then. "Why?" I didn't tell him everything. Just enough. The paralysis, the sense of weight, the shape in the corner that moved with the base. He listened, jaw tight, then nodded once, like I'd confirmed something he already half believed. "You can break the lease if you want," he said quietly. "I won't hold you to it. That room's cheap for a reason. Some people sleep fine there. Some don't. I moved out a week later. Found a place farther down the hill, paying more than I wanted for thinner walls and less convenient stairs. The first night in the new place, with only distant city noise and no bar underneath, I slept like a rock. For 3 nights. On the 4th, it came back. Different ceiling, different sounds, same slide into paralysis. My body froze. My eyes opened. There was no colored light on the walls this time, just the faint orange from a street lamp leaking around the curtains. No bass through the floor, just the hum of someone's TV 3 units over. The corner at the foot of the bed stayed empty. The weight on my chest did not. It settled heavier than before, like someone had learned the shape of me. I couldn't see anything at the foot of the bed, but the air above my face felt thick and occupied. My ears rang with that same buzzing undertone. Beneath it, I heard something that might have been breathing, slow and close. I stared at the blank space where a figure should have been and understood, with a cold clarity that cut through the panic, that whatever I'd met in that Capitol Hill studio had stopped needing walls and floors to find me. People talk about haunted buildings, haunted rooms. I used to think that way too. Now, lying awake in yet another bedroom months later, too scared to fall asleep because I can feel the mattress dip just slightly near my feet, I've started to wonder if sometimes the thing that latches on doesn't care about addresses at all. And if I keep telling myself it's just sleep paralysis, just stress, just my brain misfiring, it's partly because the only other explanation I have is that somebody else's last night found me in the room above the bar and decided it wasn't finished yet. Most people treat the ferry like a moving hallway between work and home. For me, it turned into the one place where my phone kept trying to show me a future nobody admitted had ever happened. My name is Raina, and for about a year my life was pinned between Seattle and Bainbridge Island. 35 minutes of water twice a day. The crossing became a routine. Rush to the terminal, shuffle with everyone else past the turnstiles, feel the deck rumble under my feet as the engines kicked in, then watch the skyline slide away behind the stern. I liked the observation deck most on late crossings. The wind was sharp enough to clear out the day, gulls circled and screamed above the wake, and the city's glow looked harmless from that distance. The calls started as nothing. Unknown number, no caller ID, no name, just a string of digits that never stayed the same. The first time it buzzed in my pocket, I was leaning on the rail, fingers numb from the cold metal. I glanced at the screen, frowned, and answered with a cautious, "Hello?" Deadline. No one there. Just a faint hiss, like wind over a microphone, before the call dropped. I shrugged it off. Robocalls glitch all the time. A week later, it happened again midway through another evening crossing. Different number, same result. Pickup, hiss, silence, disconnect. I started ignoring them, letting them ring out while I scrolled or stared at the black water sliding past. Then one night, I was back inside, sitting on one of the benches near the big windows. The ferry was about halfway across. Seattle was a glittering strip behind us, Bainbridge a darker lump ahead. The engines hummed under the floor. A low vibration in my shoes. Footsteps echoed on the metal stairs as people moved between decks. The smell of coffee and diesel hung in the air. My phone lit up again. Unknown number. The timing was so perfect, right as the ferry horn sounded, that I stabbed at answer on instinct instead of waiting for it to stop. This time, somebody picked up. At first, all I heard was noise. Not static exactly, more like a crowded room filtered through a wall. Voices overlapping, clipped, and indistinct. A child crying somewhere in the mix. An automated announcement chiming. Under it all, the deep, steady rumble of engines that matched the vibration in my feet a little too well. "Hello," I said. "Who is this?" The announcement on the other end cut through, suddenly clear. "All passengers, please remain calm. Crew will assist you in putting on life jackets. This is a drill." My skin went cold. I knew that voice. Anyone who rides the ferries regularly does. The same neutral recorded tone that tells you where the life jackets are and not to leave your vehicle deck during the trip. But this wasn't the usual safety spiel. This sounded urgent, layered over a background of rising panic. A man's voice shouted something I couldn't catch. There was a metallic crash, like something heavy hitting the deck. The engine's tone shifted slightly, a strained note in the hum. On my ferry, in my reality, nothing changed. The floor stayed steady. No one around me reacted. People kept reading, dozing, scrolling, their faces washed in the blue light of their screens. "Hello?" I tried again, quieter now, as if raising my voice might tear the line between whatever I was hearing and where I actually was. The announcement repeated, more distorted. "Life jackets. Crew will remain calm." A woman sobbed near the microphone, close enough that her hitching breaths overrode some of the words. Somewhere far off in that jumble of sound, I thought I heard the gulls, their cries stretched out and weird. Then the call dropped. The normal sounds of my ferry rushed back into focus. A kid laughing a few rows over, someone coughing, the faint clink of a spoon against a paper cup. The engines kept their same familiar rhythm. No one was handing out life jackets. No one was shouting. It was like I'd just stepped out of a noisy room and let the door swing shut behind me. My call log showed a duration of 23 seconds. I told myself there had to be a straightforward explanation. Maybe the ferry system was running some kind of recorded drill, and it had bled into a wrong line. Maybe someone had called me from onboard with their phone in a pocket during an exercise. I didn't like any of those answers, but they at least stayed on this side of reality. The next day, the weirdness dug in deeper. Out of sheer stubbornness, I started asking casual questions. In the terminal grabbing a coffee before boarding, I made small talk with a crew member I half knew from seeing him 100 times. "Do you guys ever do, like, surprise drills?" I asked, trying to sound more curious than nervous. "With announcements and stuff?" He shrugged. "We train," he said, But we don't freak passengers out. If we run a real-sounding drill, it's after hours or off the boat. Why? Just heard something weird on my phone last night, I said, dodging the details. He chuckled, said something about spam calls, and moved on. Later, alone with my search bar and too much imagination, I dug deeper. There were mentions here and there of a near incident on the route years back. Nothing catastrophic, no official disaster. A mechanical issue during a winter storm. A list to one side that freaked people out. Lots of rumors, few concrete facts. One article mentioned that crew had done enhanced emergency training afterward. The date on that piece made my stomach twist. The timestamp on my call log matched the anniversary of that training almost to the minute. Maybe it was coincidence. 35-minute crossings, dozens of sailings a day, lots of important moments to line up with. Brains love patterns. I told myself that while my finger hovered over the delete button on that entry and then pulled back, leaving it there like a splinter, I couldn't quite bring myself to dig out. For a while, nothing else happened. The unknown calls stopped. The ferry went back to being what it had always been. Cold wind on the observation deck, metal stairs that echoed too much, gulls screaming at the wake, commuters pretending not to see each other. Then, months later, when I'd almost convinced myself I'd made more out of it than there was, my phone rang again halfway across. Same setup. Late crossing, city behind us glowing soft and orange, water black and restless below. I was outside this time, tucked into a corner, out of the worst of the wind. My cheeks stung from the cold. My breath came out in small clouds. The engines rumbled through the metal under my boots. Unknown number. For a second, I almost let it go to voicemail. Then, with the kind of dread curiosity that makes you open a door you know you shouldn't, I answered. Noise slammed into my ear immediately. Louder than before. Closer. Someone was shouting orders through a distorted PA. Move away from the rails. Stay low. Help the person next to you. The words overlapped with other voices. People crying, praying, cursing. The sound of feet pounding on metal decks. A child's high scream cut through, so piercing I flinched. Hello, I said, but my own voice sounded small against that chaos. That was when I heard myself. Not just someone who sounded like me. My voice. Same cadence, same hitch on certain words. Coming from somewhere in that clamor, not into the phone. But behind it, off to the side of the microphone, caught by accident. It was a raw, terrified sound I didn't recognize as mine at first, because I'd never heard myself like that. A shout, half word, half noise, the kind that tears your throat. The deck beneath me was solid. The real ferry's engines stayed steady, unbothered. No one around me was panicking. A couple nearby were arguing quietly about dinner. Another guy was just filming the skyline like always. A gull swooped low, eyeing some crumbs by the rail. On the line, in my ear, the world was ending. Or almost ending. And somewhere inside that recorded panic, future or past or sideways, was a version of me who didn't make it off the deck calm and dry. Stop, I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. Please stop. The announcement voice cut in again, warped, words stretching and folding on themselves. This is drill, remain, jackets. It stuttered, then broke into static. For a heartbeat, under the roar, I heard my own name, or thought I did, yelled by my own mouth from the wrong side of time. The call went dead. The wind rushed louder in the sudden absence of noise. The ferry horn sounded, long and low. Behind us, Seattle glowed like nothing bad had ever happened or ever would. Ahead, Bainbridge waited with its dark trees and small lights at the shore. I looked down at my phone. The call log showed the same unknown format, another short duration. Same date as the old incident, just years later. Same minute offset from departure, give or take what a human memory can fudge. I still ride the ferry. Life doesn't rearrange itself around one person's strange phone calls. Schedules exist. Jobs need doing. The water between the city and the island isn't going to cross itself, but I don't answer unknown numbers on the boat anymore. When the phone buzzes now and some pattern of digits I don't recognize pops up on the screen, I let it ring against my palm while I watch the wake stretch out behind us. I listen to the engines. I count the people around me. I breathe cold air deep into my lungs and remind myself where I am right now, feet on solid deck. Because if those calls really are echoes from a disaster that never made it into the official reports, some near miss played over and over in the guts of the ship, I know this much. The version of me on the other end, wherever or whenever they are, is already screaming. And there's nothing I can say across that line that will change what happened to them, or what might still be waiting for me somewhere on a crossing I haven't taken yet. From my window, I watched neighbors come and go until I realized one door never behaved like the others. Whatever moved into Unit 304 always appeared quietly, and then just stopped existing. My name is Celia, and working from home in South Lake Union means you spend a lot of time staring at other people's windows. My studio faces a concrete courtyard ringed by nearly identical balconies, all lit at night by cold LED security lights that make everything look a little too clean. During the day, I mostly see the glow of monitors, people pacing on headsets, and the vague outlines of plants and bookshelves through frosted glass. At night, when the drizzle slicks the concrete and Mercer Street's traffic hum turns into a distant ocean, the building becomes a grid of light and shadow. Directly across from my desk, slightly to the right, is Unit 304. When I moved in, 304's blinds were down, lights off, balcony bare. A blank square like any other. The first time it caught my attention, it was just because there was finally life there. A lamp clicked on late one evening, then a silhouette drifted past the blinds, pacing in that restless way of someone unpacking. Over the next week, a plant appeared on the sill, then a bike leaned against the railing. I never saw a moving truck, never heard the thud of furniture on the stairs, but suddenly the apartment across the way looked lived in. Then, just as quietly, it didn't. The lamp stopped turning on. The bike never moved. The plant went from upright to drooping to brown in about 3 days. I noticed one morning that the blinds were raised halfway for the first time, and behind the glass the room looked hollow. No boxes, no clothes, no clutter. Just an empty room with a dead plant still in the window. A few days later, the blinds were all the way down again. The lights stayed off. I told myself it was just fast turnover. This neighborhood is full of people on short contracts, tech, startups, remote workers sampling Seattle before bouncing somewhere cheaper. I wouldn't have thought twice if it hadn't happened again, almost the same way, a month later. New lamp, different plant, different silhouette, taller, a broader outline that sat at a desk late into the night, lit by the unmistakable blue of a monitor. Sometimes that shape would stand and stretch, cross the room, disappear for a while, then come back. No one ever hauled a couch through the courtyard. No one propped the front door open with a box. One day there was nothing. The next day there was a life in that box of light. Weeks passed. The monitor glow became a familiar part of my own workday, like a parallel version of me coding across the way. Then it faded. First the late nights stopped, then evenings. Then there was a stretch of days with no light at all. The plant in 304 sagged in the window. Packages started to appear outside the door 3 floors up, small boxes with barcodes and smiling logos, while our own delivery guy came and went like normal. No one picked those packages up. Management taped a polite notice to the door. Package inside office. A few days later, maintenance came with a cart of supplies. I watched them through the courtyard as they taped plastic around the frame, sanded, painted, peeled the tape away. Business as usual. When they were done, the door looked exactly the same as before. It bothered me how often I saw the pattern repeat. By the 4th or 5th turnover, curiosity tipped into something closer to obsession. Working remotely blurs days. Keeping track of 304 gave me something concrete. I opened a spreadsheet and started logging what I saw. Date the lights first came on. Date I first saw a silhouette. Date the pattern of activity stopped. I gave each occupant a nickname in my notes. Plant girl, headphones, fairy lights, small details I could see from across the courtyard. The numbers didn't feel normal. Stays of 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 at most. Always the same. Life appears, settles, then evaporates without the usual mess of moving. In a building where most doors stayed consistent, 304 was a blinking cursor. Eventually, I tried bringing it up in the lobby, half a joke, half fishing for reassurance. 304 turns over a lot, huh? I said to the leasing agent while she tapped on her tablet. Feels like I've had more neighbors across from me than I have on my own floor. She frowned down at her screen. 304, she repeated. That unit's been vacant for a while. I laughed, thinking she'd misheard. No, directly across from 207. Blinds halfway down, plant that keeps dying. There was a guy with fairy lights for a bit. Cooks at 11 p.m. She checked again, lips pressing into a small line. Last lease ended about 4 months ago, she said. We haven't had anyone in 304 since. Sometimes corporate holds a unit for renovation or internal use. Then who have I been watching work late every night? I asked too quickly. She gave me the customer service smile people put on when they want the conversation to end. If someone's there, I don't have a record of it, she said. Do you want to transfer? It's one of the cheaper floor plans. That should have been the end of it. System glitch, miscommunication, my own boredom knitting a story out of ordinary turnover. Instead, the disconnect between my spreadsheet and her tablet made the hairs on my arm stand up. That night, I sat at my desk with the lights off, only my monitor and the courtyard LEDs washing the room in cold light. At 11:13 p.m., right when headphones used to appear, 304's lamp clicked on. Someone crossed in front of the window, backlit, a sharp-shouldered silhouette with hair in a bun, holding what looked like a mug. On paper, no one lived there. A week later, the rent increase notices hit our inboxes. Corporate language about market adjustments and maintaining quality. At the bottom, in a smaller, friendlier font, selective discounted units available, including 304. I stared at that line so long the text blurred. My printed spreadsheet of 304's timelines was still pinned to the wall next to my desk. 10 entries, 10 disappearances. At the bottom, I'd left space for more. The next day, I went back to the office. Rain streaked the glass. Somewhere nearby, a leaf blower whined. Inside, the LED lights hummed. I got the renewal email, I said. It mentioned 304 as a cheaper option. The leasing agent brightened. Yes, if your current rate is too high, we can transfer you, she said. Similar square footage, slightly higher floor, discounted because it's been empty. Empty, I repeated. She turned the tablet to me just enough to show a line. Unit 304, vacant, last occupied, date 6 months ago. From where I stood, I could see through the lobby windows into the courtyard. Up 3 floors and over 1 unit, a faint glow bled at the edge of 304's blinds, like someone had left a screen on. What about maintenance painting that door every few weeks? I asked. The packages piling up, the lights I see on almost every night. Routine refresh, she said. Sometimes packages get misdelivered. I can put in a note if you're concerned, but honestly, 304 is a great deal. If you don't want to renew in 207, it's probably your best option to stay in the building. On the way back up, the elevator's mirrored walls made the hallway behind me look longer than it was. When I stepped into my apartment, I didn't take my coat off right away. I walked straight to the window. 304 was dark, blinds fully down, balcony empty. My phone buzzed with a follow-up. Hi, Celia. Per our chat, 304 is now on hold under your name as a transfer option. Just sign the attached form if you decide to move. The cursor in my spreadsheet blinked in the next empty cell under tenant 10. I picked up a pen, wrote today's date, and left the rest blank. That night, I closed my blinds completely for the first time since I'd moved in. If you're listening to this on Haunted Fears, and you've ever watched one specific window in your building a little too much, ask yourself, if your landlord offered you a discount to move into the unit no one seems to keep, would you trust their system or the pattern your own eyes already saw? Drop your answer in the comments. And if these stories hit the same uneasy spot in your chest, make sure you join the Haunted Fears horror family so you don't face your own hallway shadows alone.